What is the true story of the Mediterranean antiquity? Welcome to Calapex, where history comes to life and where each video immerses you in the destiny of those who shaped the world. Today, get ready to embark on one of the greatest journeys in human history. From the banks of the Nile to the hills of Rome, from the palaces of Crete to the ports of Carthage, the Mediterranean was more than just a sea. It was a world of exchanges, conquests, gods, and philosophies where civilizations clashed, intertwined, and inspired one another, driven by the salty wind and the fire of ambitions. Pharaohs, Phoenician sailors, Greek orators, Roman legionaries, forgotten queens, and merchants from beyond the Pillars of Hercules wrote the Mediterranean epic on stone and in blood. Here were born the alphabets, the laws, the founding myths, and the first glimmers of a world. But behind the grandeur of the temples and the glory of the empires, a question remains. What is the true story of the Mediterranean antiquity? But before we embark on a new adventure, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel to not miss anything. Thank you and bon voyage. Around 3000 before Christ, the planet finds itself in a phase of relative climatic stability, resulting from the end of the last great glacial period, which ended several millennia earlier. The continental ice sheets that once covered vast portions of the northern hemisphere continued to melt, causing a long-term rise in sea levels. Although this phenomenon was not as abrupt as some prehistoric events, it continued at a regular pace, gradually altering the geographical features of various coastal regions. In the Mediterranean, the coastline slowly stabilized, allowing populations to settle permanently on shores that were now relatively constant. These changes, spread over several centuries, influenced societies that began to better manage their environment while seeking to develop adapted techniques for agriculture, fishing, and maritime trade. The emerging Bronze Age. What is the true story of the Mediterranean antiquity? Welcome to Calapex, where history comes to life and where each video immerses you in the destiny of those who shaped the world. Today, get ready to embark on one of the greatest journeys in human history. From the banks of the Nile to the hills of Rome, from the palaces of Crete to the ports of Carthage, the Mediterranean was more than just a sea. It was a world of exchanges, conquests, gods, and philosophies where civilizations clashed, intertwined, and inspired one another, driven by the salty wind and the fire of ambitions. Pharaohs, Phoenician sailors, Greek orators, Roman legionaries, forgotten queens, and merchants from beyond the Pillars of Hercules wrote the Mediterranean epic on stone and in blood. Here were born the alphabets, the laws, the founding myths, and the first glimmers of a world. But behind the grandeur of the temples and the glory of the empires, a question remains. What is the true story of the Mediterranean antiquity? But before we embark on a new adventure, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel to not miss anything. Thank you and bon voyage. Around 3000 before Christ, the planet finds itself in a phase of relative climatic stability, resulting from the end of the last great glacial period, which ended several millennia earlier. The continental ice sheets that once covered vast portions of the northern hemisphere continued to melt, causing a long-term rise in sea levels. Although this phenomenon was not as abrupt as some prehistoric events, it continued at a regular pace, gradually altering the geographical features of various coastal regions. In the Mediterranean, the coastline slowly stabilized, allowing populations to settle permanently on shores that were now relatively constant. These changes, spread over several centuries, influenced societies that began to better manage their environment while seeking to develop adapted techniques for agriculture, fishing, and maritime trade. The emerging Bronze Age, dated around 3000 before Christ, witnessed the rise of various major civilizations spread over vast areas. In the Near East, Mesopotamia stood out as one of the regions where the first forms of urban life developed. Situated between the Tigris and Euphrates, this region housed a patchwork of city-states that exploited river water to irrigate fields and assimilate fundamental hydraulic techniques. At the same time, the Indus Valley in South Asia also developed comparable urban centers. The archaeological sites of Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, often dated to the mid-3rd millennium before Christ, bear witness to an advanced political, economic, and social organization based on agriculture and the circulation of goods over long distances. In these two areas, the mastery of rivers was a decisive lever for demographic and political expansion. Mesopotamian and Indus Valley populations turned toward new exchange networks while their artisans were already experimenting with copper metallurgy, the first step in a material evolution that would prepare for the advent of true bronze, an alloy where tin would begin to play a vital role in the solidity of weapons and tools. In the northeast of Africa, Egypt of the Old Kingdom was organized around the Nile. This period, roughly covering the 3rd, Ophir, 5th, and 6th dynasties, was characterized by strong centralization under the authority of the pharaohs. The river, nourishing through its annual floods, constituted the major axis linking the Mediterranean delta to the more southern regions. Agricultural production provided the economic foundation that allowed for the construction of gigantic monuments, including the pyramids at Giza, commissioned notably by Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaure. Egyptian rulers also explored the Sinai to extract mineral resources, such as copper and turquoise. On the Red Sea, expeditions set out in search of obsidian, a hard volcanic rock used for its excellent cutting properties and for prestige objects. Egypt did not exist in isolation. It sent ships to the Levant, seeking to procure wood, particularly cedar, and participating in a vast network of exchanges linking North Africa to the Near East. More to the east, in areas corresponding to present-day China, several cultures are emerging. This is the case, for example, of the early Tu and Longshan cultures, which are developing between the 3rd and 2nd millennium before Christ. Without being completely unified under an imperial power, a situation that will only occur during the time of the Qin dynasty much later, these areas see the formation of early political entities that lay the foundations for primitive bronze craftsmanship. Jade, a highly symbolic stone, is also manipulated, highly valued for adorning objects and ceremonial statues. Foundry techniques remain uneven, but mineral extraction and alloy knowledge are progressing. Communities are structured around elites capable of mobilizing skilled craftsmen. Agriculture is consolidated thanks to rice cultivation in some wet regions or cereal cultivation like millet in drier climate areas. Having reached an advanced degree of organization, the early Tu and Longshan cultures developed new funerary practices and proto-writing systems, still in the form of rudimentary signs engraved on bones or pottery. In Europe, the Atlantic facade and the Baltic space constitute a heterogeneous world marked by a great diversity of lifestyles, from communities of hunter-fishermen to the first firmly established farmers. Some peoples erect impressive megalithic structures, including alignments of menhirs or monumental dolmens. The testimonies of this megalithism can be admired from the Atlantic coast of the Iberian Peninsula to the northern regions of Europe through Brittany and the British Isles. Moreover, amber extracted from the shores of the Baltic Sea is already passing hand to hand, crossing great distances to fuel a commerce highly prized by the elites of the continent. Amber, this fossil resin, is attributed various symbolic and ornamental virtues. Sometimes mounted in jewelry or used as an amulet, it crosses mountain ranges and traverses the plains of Central Europe, paving the way for long trading routes that foreshadow more structured commercial networks to come. In the Iberian Peninsula in the south, copper deposits, a crucial metal for tool-making and the fabrication of rudimentary weapons, are also beginning to be exploited. On the Mediterranean coast, the intensification of contacts is already palpable. The region, far from being locked in geographical isolation, sees travelers, merchants, and even sometimes entire populations in search of more favorable lands. The slowing down of rising waters consolidates a coastline where primitive ports are developing. Navigation remains modest, often coastal. Sailors do not yet venture out into the open sea over long distances, but begin to use simple sailing vessels in addition to rowing. Navigation techniques are being refined, allowing for bolder expeditions. The winds in the Mediterranean, often predictable, facilitate these maritime ventures, although seasonal storms are still dreaded. Aboard their ships, the crews transport, notably, raw materials such as copper, obsidian, and precious wood. They also exchange ideas, techniques, and even mythical or religious stories that circulate from one region to another. In this rapidly changing world, some knowledge spreads widely because it addresses common challenges. Copper metallurgy, to name just one, crosses multiple borders, adapting to local mining resources. The Anatolian Peninsula, Sinai, the Caucasus, and southern Spain are valued reservoirs for this metal. Artisans are also experimenting with the first fusions combining copper and tin, which precedes the advent of better quality bronze. Societies that gradually master this metallurgy reinforce their influence. Clan or city leaders can thus claim a status of authority by relying on privileged access to the production of stronger weapons and more efficient tools. Among these tools, axes and spearheads gain robustness, facilitating not only agriculture, but also warfare and hunting. In parallel, writing, still in its nascent stages, evolves in several major centers. In Mesopotamia, from the end of the 4th millennium before Christ, pictographic signs, ancestors of cuneiform writing, allow the recording of administrative or accounting information. On clay tablets, the number of heads of cattle, grain quantities, and various commercial exchanges are inscribed. In Egypt, hieroglyphic writing emerges, expressly linked to the person of the pharaoh and to religion. Scribes refine a complex system of symbols to represent both sounds and ideas, promoting the emergence of a centralized bureaucracy. In China, rudimentary signs, similar to pictograms, lay the groundwork for future oracle script. In the Aegean world, writing remains in its infancy, but simple marking systems might exist to identify pottery, goods, or artisan signatures. This advancement in writing allows for improved transmission of knowledge and management of communities. Leaders, whose power extends over growing territories, can better administer, control resources, seal alliances, or document the rituals and laws that regulate social life. Although each civilization presents cultural specificities, around 3,000 before Christ bridges are already being established. The Mediterranean, in particular, occupies a geographic position that connects Africa, Asia, and Europe. To the south, Egypt opens onto the Horn of Africa and the Red Sea, allowing connections with obsidian resources in Ethiopia and possibly routes toward the Persian Gulf. To the east, the Levant serves as an interface with the Arabian Peninsula and Mesopotamia. To the north, the European continent unfolds, with its major rivers like the Danube, the route of Baltic amber, and a range of cultures, some of which adopt Eastern innovations. These riparian or inland societies develop ties of interdependence, whether it involves exchanges of raw materials, luxury objects, or technical knowledge. Primitive ports or trading posts that appear on these shores are the seeds of future large-scale merchant cities. Even though most of these exchanges remain local or regional, the existence of exotic products far from their place of origin demonstrates the presence of nascent trade routes. Pearls of Indian origin, shells from the Red Sea, or amber from the Baltic slowly drift into various spheres of influence, sometimes evoking admiration, sometimes envy, and fueling collective imagination. In the Aegean world, although Crete and the Cycladic Islands have not yet entered the powerful Minoan phase, island communities thrive by exploiting the sea to feed themselves and import what they lack: metals, grains, or precious stones. Archaeologists already identify signs of advanced navigation, such as the use of simple sails, and sometimes rudimentary onboard tools to measure travel time or navigate by the stars. The islands, by nature, serve as stops in maritime journeys marked by layovers. This network of halts in the eastern Mediterranean, combined with the expertise acquired by seafarers, lays the groundwork for a commercial dynamism that will grow throughout the second millennium. During this same period, other innovations contribute to connecting human groups inland. For instance, the use of draft animals, like the donkey in Egypt and Mesopotamia, facilitates the transport of heavier loads along caravan routes. Camels, still scarcely domesticated around 3000 before Christ, will gain in importance a few centuries later. The use of the wheel, documented in Mesopotamia at the turn of the third millennium, revolutionizes the speed of movement and logistics efficiency. The hydraulic civilizations of Mesopotamia and the Indus Valley, already experts in managing canals and retention basins, more easily distribute agricultural surpluses. The navigable waters of the Nile, the Tigris, and the Euphrates play a decisive role in unifying territories under the aegis of central powers, be it Mesopotamian kings or Egyptian pharaohs. European societies located far from the Mediterranean in the current center of the continent in Germania or up to the northern fringes do not experience the same urban density or the same writing as those of the Near East or Egypt, but remain connected through networks of exchange involving metals and amber. The land routes, although arduous, lead from one human grouping to another, spreading multiple innovations. Metal, particularly copper, grants certain chiefs a dominant position in terms of prestige. In these more tribal societies, metal objects can assume an almost sacred status, reflecting both the ability to forge distant alliances and to mobilize the workforce necessary for extraction and casting. Funerary rites become more elaborate, especially when a leader or notable figure is buried with their gear: copper blades, amber ornaments, decorated pottery. In the Baltic sphere, archaeological deposits provide evidence of contacts, including with steppe areas further east, via the Danube Valley or the river corridors of Eastern Europe. All signs that the Mediterranean, while remaining a unique space, is not alone in developing its craftsmanship or exchanges, but it nevertheless occupies a central role as a cultural and economic interface. This emerging Bronze Age is neither homogeneous nor synchronous from one region to another. Dates vary according to centers of innovation. Some environments already possess advanced techniques, while others retain more deeply rooted Neolithic traditions. In the Anatolian Peninsula, copper and bronze objects have long been crafted, whereas in some European territories, polished stone continues to serve as the primary tool. The overall dynamic, nonetheless, relies on transfers of skills that accelerate sporadically thanks to the dissemination of new weapons, the attraction of rare natural resources, and the emergence of warrior or priestly elites eager to gain prestige through the introduction of exotic goods. Changes herald a system of exchange which, without being fully globalized, is already remarkably extensive for its time. Land caravans traverse ancient paths, boats cautiously navigate the coasts, and humans gradually learned to cross seas and rivers to seek what they cannot find at home. During this period, the intertwining of oral traditions, religious practices, and varied craftsmanship creates a vast cultural heritage from which many traces reach us. Symbols of power, such as scepters, crowns, or crafted jewelry, often incorporate worked metal and rare stones. In the major urban centers developing in Mesopotamia or Egypt, temples begin to be erected in honor of deities revered for ensuring the proper flow of floods, protecting crops, or achieving military success. Rites ensure social cohesion and strengthen the authority of kings or pharaohs, considered privileged intermediaries between divine forces and the human world. In this context, the Mediterranean sees pilgrims, merchants, and exiles passing through, contributing to a proliferation of beliefs and influences. The diversity of the coastal peoples is observed in the artistic styles: pottery decorated with geometric patterns, cult statues, or miniature figurines, countless animal representations. Societies sometimes use marine shells as a dormant or unit of exchange, indicating that the coastline already enjoys symbolic and economic value. Strategic coastal sites may be surrounded by modest fortifications in case of foreign incursion, or be equipped with rudimentary docks to facilitate unloading. Some historians and archaeologists speculate that there were already transshipment points where ships from distant lands meet, thus preparing the ground for more organized future maritime expansions. Coastal navigations, for the most part, nonetheless encourage the awareness that the marine world holds countless riches. The waterfront communities, constrained by occasionally challenging terrain or by infertile soils, turn towards the sea and take from it fish, crustaceans, and mollusks, supplementing their diet. Tuna fishing, for example, becomes an opportunity to gather communities in a coordinated effort, all the more anticipated since it can offer trade surpluses. The salting of fish, its smoking or drying, initiates a small yet organized primitive industry around preservation. Meanwhile, salt is harvested from salt marshes, indispensable for food preservation and which can be exchanged as a valuable product. Farmers, for their part, benefit from a mild climate, with dry summers and humid and mild winters, favoring the cultivation of barley, wheat, and gradually vine or olive tree in certain areas, although some of these crops will mainly develop later. Beyond economic and productive aspects, around 3000 before Christ, the Mediterranean already occupies a pivotal place in the articulation of routes linking Eastern Africa, the Arabian Peninsula, the Levant, Anatolia, and further into the Eurasian steppe. Exchanges are not just a movement of goods, they also carry ideas and techniques. Metal treatments, seal carving, jewelry making, and rudimentary astronomy for maritime orientation all circulate slowly, sometimes transforming or combining with local know-how. This syncretic dimension is not yet fully apparent, but it is glimpsed in certain material objects, where Near Eastern, Egyptian, and sometimes even more distant influences coexist. Potteries found on Greek islands or the Levantine coasts may bear motifs evoking distant traditions. The inscribed symbols sometimes reflect cosmological beliefs borrowed from other peoples. Thus, the sea acts as a linkage, fostering both curiosity and caution. Commercial ties are not limited to the simple quest for goods. In Mesopotamia, obsidian from the volcanic sources of Anatolia or the Levant is highly valued for the production of cutting tools and ornaments. In Egypt, beyond copper, the gold extracted from the eastern desert is valued, and will circulate in exchange circuits well before the emergence of strict monetary systems. One could imagine the merchants of the time leading their rudimentary caravels from port to port, exchanging skins, raw stones, cereals, or livestock. Encounters, sometimes peaceful and sometimes more violent, between people from different backgrounds eventually lead to alliances, rivalries, or even localized conflicts that the archaeological documentation still struggles to reconstruct in detail. Nonetheless, these multiple interactions lay the foundations of a Mediterranean space, which, while remaining politically fragmented, is already unified by the sea, navigation, and human ambitions. The knowledge our ancestors had of their coastal and maritime environment, even if partial, was sufficient to open this age of discoveries. Although there are still shadowy areas regarding the exact organization of certain communities, there is a perceived willingness to explore, enrich regional traditions, and establish increasingly distant contacts. This continuous convocation of knowledge, carried by sailors, by caravan leaders, and by those who would later be called diplomats, reveals a Mediterranean already oriented towards interconnection. By water or land, exchanges travel long distances, linking the first hydraulic states of the Mesopotamian basin and the Indus Valley, the monumental palaces of pharaonic Egypt, the emerging cultures of ancient China, and the mosaic of European peoples. Key techniques, copper metallurgy, sailing navigation, figurative writing, form the bridges of a shared momentum of progress, accompanying urban growth, deepened settlement, and social diversification. The Mediterranean regions thus maintained early relations with Asia, Africa, and continental Europe, forming a discrete but very real network of exchanges of extraordinary products and crucial innovations. The cities that developed, like those in Lower Mesopotamia or the Indus Valley, were too distant to have direct contact with all the Mediterranean populations, yet they were integrated into staggered circuits where multiple intermediaries and stages were interposed. At each segment, a link was added, the cargo was forwarded, or it was transformed along the way. Civilizations evolved across territories fractured by natural barriers, mountains, deserts, seas, but thanks to a progressive understanding of geography, their branches extended step by step. The precise events of this era remain sometimes difficult to reconstruct because the written sources are still embryonic. Mesopotamian tablets, the first Egyptian hieroglyphs, or early Chinese symbols provide information mostly administrative or devotional in nature. Archaeological evidence, however, highlights the circulation of exotic objects very far from their initial origin. Builders erected or perfected monumental structures using techniques inherited through observation or oral transmission. Despite the absence of fully marked maritime routes, Mediterranean sailors learned to navigate by sight, using the position of the sun and stars as guides. Meanwhile, in other regions, river transportation was used, deemed safer and easier for convoys of significant merchandise. Around 3000 before Christ, Egypt began one of the most prosperous periods in its history, marked by the development of the institutions of the Old Kingdom and later the Middle Kingdom. The pharaohs, divine incarnations on earth, orchestrated a political centralization that allowed them to undertake vast architectural and military projects. The construction of the pyramids at Giza, under the famous reigns of Khufu, also known as Cheops, Khafre, and Menkaure, is the most striking example of this excessive ambition. Huge stacks of blocks, transported by barges on the Nile, were used to erect these monumental royal tombs, consecrating the pharaoh's power. Thousands of workers, coordinated by a hierarchical administration, participated in these projects. While agricultural prosperity took advantage of the regular flooding of the river, the ruling power fostered the rise of a corps of officials, trained in the art of hieroglyphic and hieratic writing, tasked with recording the harvests and managing supplies. In parallel, expeditions launched to Sinai ensured access to copper and turquoise mines, two precious resources for metallurgy and ornamentation. The reliefs engraved in the rock of the Sinai Desert testify to the Egyptian presence, highlighting the organization and success of these expeditions in difficult areas. The copper obtained greatly contributed to the production of bronze tools and weapons, stimulating an even broader exchange dynamic. Being aware of their dependence on external resources for quality wood, the pharaohs strengthened their ties with coastal Levantine cities, notably Byblos, from which the cedars indispensable to shipbuilding came. The archives mention fleets of ships laden with massive logs, coasting along the shore to the mouth of the Nile. These cedar fleets from Lebanon, sometimes escorted by diplomatic envoys, illustrate the Egyptian desire to develop stable relations with partners in the Levant. Beyond its military and architectural importance, this wood is just as coveted on a symbolic level. Certain sarcophagi or elements of temples integrate cedar to emphasize the preeminence of the king, associating the robustness and longevity of this tree with the divine attributes of the pharaoh. The following dynasties perpetuate these practices, ensuring the economic continuity and artistic evolution of the Nile Valley. After a period of internal turmoil during the first intermediate period between 2200 and 2050. Before Christ, Egypt revives under the Middle Kingdom, regaining its political cohesion and resuming economic expansion. The pharaohs, now established in Thebes, send new missions to Sinai or the south of Nubia to exploit gold, ivory, or ebony, while keeping a watchful eye on the trading activity in the Mediterranean. Delta ports, such as Buhen, experience growing traffic facilitated by the simple sail and the first attempts at open sea navigation. Egyptian objects, such as scarab seals or engraved amulets, make their way to Crete and mainland Greece, proof that the influence of the double kingdom on the Mediterranean chessboard continues to grow. On the southern limits of the Aegean Sea, Crete sees the flourishing of the Minoan civilization, whose origin dates to the end of the 3rd millennium before Christ, and whose rise coincides with the development of large palatial courts like Knossos, Phaistos, or Malia. The Minoan palaces, devoid of imposing walls, suggest that Crete relies more on its naval mastery than on land fortifications to ensure its security. The famous site of Knossos, explored from the early 20th century by the British archaeologist Sir Arthur Evans, is a vast architectural complex, featuring a maze of corridors, storage rooms, central courtyards, and even water drainage systems. The colorful frescoes depicting marine motifs, plants, or scenes of bull leaping around a sacred bull reflect a culture deeply connected to ritual celebrations and the veneration of local deities. Minoan Crete invents or adopts the so-called linear A script, whose primary function consists of recording economic and administrative transactions, although it remains enigmatic to contemporary researchers. Through this organization, one can perceive a society led by an aristocratic or royal elite, overseeing the redistribution of agricultural goods, metals, and handcrafted products while exercising symbolic control through religious worship. The Minoans become skilled sailors, their vessels, equipped with linen sails and oars, venture along the Aegean, Levantine coasts, and probably farther towards Egypt, feeding an extensive network of trade. Fine pottery produced in Crete, often adorned with geometric or naturalistic motifs, is found on other islands of the archipelago and up to the foothills of western Anatolia, while Crete imports tin, copper, or precious materials for its bronze workshops. The relationships maintained with Egypt suggest official exchanges, as Minoan objects are discovered in Egyptian tombs, and motifs featuring lotus or papyrus appear in Cretan iconography. Beyond commerce, Crete also disseminates a form of cultural prestige. The central role accorded to the bull likely influences certain Greek religious traditions, culminating in myths like that of the Minotaur. On a technical level, Minoan ingenuity in shipbuilding and logistics inspires many coastal peoples, who observe with fascination the coordinated maneuvers of this agile fleet. The Minoan civilization, strong in its maritime networks and palatial organization, thus lays the foundations of an effective thalassocracy, connecting the island to other centers of influence while preserving a singular artistic and cultural identity. In the heart of the Aegean Sea, the Cyclades archipelago witnessed the development of a singular insular culture between 3000 and 2000 before Christ, famed for its elegant marble figurines. Carved from stone quarried in Paros or Naxos, these statuettes, often feminine, exhibit pure and minimalist forms. Archaeologists have unearthed multiple examples, some measuring only a few centimeters and others nearly a meter tall. Their function is still debated: a cult object, a mythical representation of a goddess, a symbol of fertility, or simply a social marker accompanied by funerary rituals. In any case, they reveal a profound aesthetic sense combined with great mastery of marble abrasion techniques carried out using stone tools, obsidian, or sometimes metal. Concurrently, the discovery of tombs containing ceramic vases painted with linear motifs as well as silver or gold jewelry suggests the existence of hierarchical social groups willing to invest in prestige goods. Obsidian, notably sourced from the island of Melos, was a crucial resource for these insular economies. This volcanic rock with a formidable edge, exploited since the Neolithic period, was fashioned into blades or flakes used for scraping, cutting, or engraving. As metallurgy had not yet fully taken hold at the very beginning of the early Bronze Age, obsidian remained highly sought after. The Cyclades exported this material to mainland Greece and Crete, taking advantage of the rise of coastal trade. Small boats with oars and square sails traveled from island to island, transporting goods like olive oil, wine, grains, and returning with manufactured products. These maritime flows created a web of interactions where the Cyclades asserted themselves as an essential link, connecting the Aegean Anatolia, Minoan centers, and potentially regions further north via land routes. Excavations conducted at coastal sites show the presence of Cycladic objects as far as Macedonia or Thrace, highlighting a desire for already vibrant inter-community exchanges. Religious life remains quite mysterious due to the lack of written texts, but it is assumed that open-air sanctuaries on certain islands were used to celebrate maritime or fertility-related deities. Processions, likely punctuated by songs and dances, must have strengthened the inhabitants' cohesion, while funerary rites and collective tombs demonstrate a desire to perpetuate the group through offerings. The importance of maritime trade is also reflected in the distribution of habitats, sometimes situated on high ground, to watch over the coastline. These villages were oriented around natural slips where boats could easily be beached. Political authority, probably not highly centralized, might have relied on local leaders from ancestral clans or maritime lineages, capable of negotiating sporadic treaties with Crete or other neighbors. Thus, the Cyclades developed a strong cultural identity, characterized by the omnipresence of obsidian, the production of marble statuettes, and the dynamics of exchanges with the entire Aegean basin. Around 2000 before Christ, the Mediterranean world entered a phase of economic and cultural growth, evidenced by the rise of numerous cities, more complex political dynamics, and intense trade networks. In the vast region stretching from the Syro-Canaanite coast to the Nile Valley, commercial flows increased, fueling unprecedented prosperity. The first centuries of the second millennium before Christ correspond to what is commonly called the Middle Bronze Age, an era where bronze metallurgy, an alloy of copper and tin, supported the production of weapons, tools, and prestige objects. The maritime dimension became more pronounced as sturdier vessels allowed for the transport of cargoes and merchants across the eastern Mediterranean. Temples and palaces developed, serving not only as administrative centers, but also as storage places for valuable goods. The crossroads societies of the Levant, grouped under the designation of Syro-Canaan, played a pivotal role in the exchange of essential goods necessary for the functioning of many neighboring kingdoms. This geographical area, known as Syro-Canaanite, extends from the Phoenician coast, including cities like Byblos or Sidon, to the inland plains, where Mesopotamian influence is evident. To the north, Mary, situated near the Euphrates, takes on strategic importance thanks to its location on the overland routes linking Lower Mesopotamia, Akkadian, and Sumerian to the Mediterranean facade. The rulers of Mary, whose names have been found on archived tablets, excel in the art of diplomatic negotiation. The royal palace of Mari, a vast complex decorated with frescoes and housing thousands of cuneiform documents, reveals the existence of regular embassies and trade agreements based on the movement of metals, textiles, and luxury goods. The tablets found address subjects ranging from marriage agreements between dynasties to the precise management of warehouses. This so-called diplomacy cargo consists of weaving alliances through the systematic sending of shipments of sesame oil, perfumed ointments, horses, or ingots intended to seal mutual trust between kingdoms. Byblos, on the current Lebanese coast, plays a key role in the timber trade of cedar wood. This material, essential for the construction of ships and buildings, is highly prized in Egypt, where the Nile does not provide enough quality logs. Egyptian naval expeditions periodically sail up to Byblos to obtain these precious logs. The pharaohs, aware of the vital nature of this trade, win the favor of the Canaanite cities through lavish gifts and reciprocal exchanges. In Egyptian royal tombs, objects of Levantine origin can be found: pottery, jewelry, bronze basins, evidence of the intensity of these relations. Egyptian scarabs, these small religious and administrative seals, also circulate throughout the Levant, sometimes appearing in Canaanite sanctuaries, indicating the interpenetration of beliefs. Further north, Ugarit, near present-day Ras Shamra in Syria, plays a similar role as a maritime hub. Its natural harbor allows for the reception and export of cereals, olive oil, pine resin, and especially raw materials essential for the production of bronze. The workshops of Ugarit, where highly skilled craftsmen work, produce ox hide ingots, a typical form for transporting solid molten metal. The archives of Ugarit, contemporary with these exchanges, will mainly come a little later, but the first traces of international exchanges are already perceptible during the Middle Bronze Age. In the administrative texts written in cuneiform script, one can discern records of ships and lists of goods: tin, copper, lapis lazuli, ivory, or wine. Caravans of donkeys and mules ensure by land the connection with the hinterland, while single sailboats follow the coasts to transport their cargoes to Crete, Cyprus, or Egypt. Alliances strengthen according to needs, and diplomatic marriages multiply. Princesses from Mari or Aleppo go to live in the household of a Canaanite governor, while Egyptian dignitaries sometimes receive Syrian wheat to cope with local shortages. These links between city-states, complex and sometimes fragile, nevertheless create a common economic space where food products are exchanged as well as monumental architectural techniques. In Crete, the Minoan civilization reaches its peak. Since the early Bronze Age, the Minoans have developed a palace art, with the most famous example being the Palace of Knossos. However, at the beginning of the second millennium before Christ, other monumental complexes appear in Phaistos, Malea, or Zakros, attesting to a hierarchical society that is very focused on the sea. The Minoans, skilled navigators, travel the eastern Mediterranean to acquire raw materials they lack: copper, tin, ornamental stones, or even luxury products like certain perfumes. This period, known as the Middle Palace period in Crete, is characterized by the rise of a sophisticated administration, probably managed in linear A writing. It is known that Crete maintains privileged relations with Egypt, whose representations sometimes depict men of Keftiu, an Egyptian term supposed to refer to the Minoans, or, more generally, the inhabitants of the Aegean islands. The murals found in the Nile Delta, notably in Avaris, the capital of the Hyksos, and later the royal residence of the 18th dynasty, depict bull-leaping scenes reminiscent of Minoan frescoes. The symbolic importance of these Tauroka-Thapsi events, where acrobats are shown jumping over the horns of a bull, demonstrates the Cretan influence on Egypt, or at least the fascination stirred by the art of the bull in Crete. In the same vein, an anecdote reported by several ancient art historians mentions the discovery in Egypt of an alabaster bull statuette, supposedly a diplomatic gift offered by an emissary from Keftiu. This piece of great finesse would symbolize the Cretan desire to impress the Egyptian court with the virtuosity of its sculptors. Egypt, on its side, sends to the Minoans copper ingots, possibly coming from the Sinai mines, as well as high-quality linen fabrics, scented oils, and sometimes ritual objects. Some amulets bearing Egyptian hieroglyphs are also found in Cretan religious deposits, indicating that the religious dimension of these contacts goes beyond a simple logic of economic profit. These long-distance relationships also involve Cyprus, which from this time specializes in the extraction and export of copper metal, from which the island derives its name. The abundant deposits in the Troodos region provide the raw material that is shipped as ingots to Cretan, Syrian, or Anatolian workshops. Cypriot merchants, often leading small fleets, actively participate in these maritime routes, taking advantage of Cyprus's central position in the eastern Mediterranean basin. However, exchanges remain risky. Climatic hazards, dangerous reefs, and occasional piracy require the formation of strong alliances with coastal powers. Some seals found in Crete and Byblos display mixed Egyptian, Minoan, and Levantine motifs, demonstrating the existence of a common visual language likely to facilitate the mutual recognition of ships and cargoes. The tablets also mention agreements for free passage for certain fleets, suggesting that diplomatic or commercial status could confer a form of extraterritoriality in certain ports. During this period, Egypt itself undergoes changing political phases, with the end of the Old Kingdom, then the emergence of the Middle Kingdom around 2050 before Christ. The pharaohs of the 12th dynasty, such as Senusret III or Amenemhat III, take advantage of a strong central administration to fund expeditions to Nubia or Sinai. The turquoise and copper mines, essential for the production of luxury items, are exploited under strict control. Commemorative steles testify to the effort made by the Egyptian state to secure these mining routes. The presence of craftsmen and scribes, sent from Memphis or Thebes, is observed in the Arabian Peninsula and on the Levantine coast, but sporadically. Official exchanges with Crete, although little described in Egyptian sources, appear in filigree thanks to the Cretan Aegean objects found in the tombs of high dignitaries. This circulation of goods, know-how, and even stylistic modes is particularly reflected in certain representations of Egyptian art, where one discerns geometric motifs typical of the Aegean world. To the north and west of mainland Greece, we also notice the assertion of regional cultures that contribute on their scale to the great currents of exchange. The Cyclades, an archipelago already renowned at the time for its obsidian, particularly that of Melos, and its famous marble idols, now receive more Levantine imports. Small exotic figurines, perhaps intended for cults never deciphered, circulate from island to island. The mining wells of the Cyclades, less rich than those of Cyprus, are not sufficient to supply the copper needed for bronze tool production, prompting the islanders to trade more actively with Minoan companies. The natural harbors of Santorini, Thera, or Naxos offer comfortable stopovers for sailors traveling between Asia Minor and Crete. As for the shores of western Anatolia, they host port cities sometimes in an embryonic state that also benefit from this commercial effervescence. Further west, the Adriatic facade begins to gradually integrate into the Mediterranean circuits. In regions situated between the Dalmatian coast and the Balkan interior, the appearance of fortified sites is observed, often perched on hills and surrounded by stone enclosures. The so-called Castellieri culture, named from the word castelliere, referring to these fortified dwellings, develops along the Adriatic coast and penetrates the area of present-day Slovenia, Istria, and Friuli. These human groups, with a craftsmanship still modest compared to that of Crete or Syria, nonetheless master certain techniques of bronze and copper work learned through intermediaries. No writing is attested at this stage, but archaeological remains suggest a sufficiently structured social organization to establish permanent dwelling areas, storage spaces, and common defenses. The relations between the Castellieri populations and the major centers of the eastern Mediterranean occur indirectly via a complex network of land and river routes. The Danube, a crucial trade artery crossing Central Europe, serves as a corridor for the transport of Baltic amber, this precious fossil resin that has fascinated Mediterranean elites for ages. Amber is prized for its warm color, lightness, and its ability to become electrically charged when rubbed, a phenomenon that already intrigued the ancients. Minoan or Canaanite artisans use it to craft necklaces, pendants, and jewelry elements intended for royal courts or sanctuaries. On certain pieces, amber inlays can be found alongside semi-precious stones such as lapis lazuli, amethyst, or carnelian, creating a highly sought-after shimmering effect. Merchants traveling the land routes must cross hill after hill, often in caravans, to reach the Adriatic coast, then board small vessels that hug the shore to reach more active stops, such as the mouths of the Po River in northern Italy, or the protected gulfs of Epirus in northwestern Greece. South of the Adriatic, local groups are also becoming familiar with the use of bronze. Small-scale artisanal workshops produce spearheads and axes, indicating a technical organization probably taught by itinerant artisans from the Aegean or the Anatolian coast. In the tombs of these regions, amber beads are occasionally found, suggesting that the resin from the Baltic does not stop at the eastern royal courts alone, but slowly spreads throughout the Mediterranean basin. Local populations, whether technicians or warriors, gradually adopt certain naval construction techniques inspired by the Minoans, facilitating coastal navigation and the eventual crossing to Italy. This partial integration reinforces the hypothesis that, as early as the Middle Bronze Age, the entire Mediterranean is not merely a conglomerate of isolated regions, but forms a space of sustained contacts. Recent archaeological excavations at sites of the Castellieri culture have revealed fragments of imported ceramics resembling those produced in mainland Greece during the same period. There are also bronze objects showing typical Aegean ornamentation, such as spirals or miniature double-axe motifs. This stylistic hybridization reflects the circulation of two major elements: material goods and the artisans themselves who spread local knowledge and aesthetics. One can imagine that some potters, metallurgists, or Syro-Canaanite merchants, after passing through the Aegean Sea, chose to explore new markets in the Adriatic to establish contacts with the populations living in these fortified oppida. Information on the movements of these merchants remains fragmented in the absence of written documents in these regions, but the material evidence suggests a phenomenon of technological dissemination. Moreover, Baltic amber is not the only exotic product coveted. Some tin pieces, indispensable for making bronze, also circulate from more northern European sources. It is not exactly known whether the tin originated more from Cornwall or from continental deposits, but the convergence of minerals to the south remains evident. The Danubian regions thus serve as junctions, allowing caravans to cross while supplying various metals or rare materials, then reach the Adriatic coast. On site, intermediaries take over to distribute these goods along the coastline before entrusting the cargo to seasoned sailors capable of reaching Greece or southern Italy. Each stopover resembles a micro-universe where goods are negotiated, bartered, repackaged, and redirected. Cypriot copper, continental tin, Baltic amber, Syrian textiles, and Cretan ceramics form an eclectic mosaic, a symptom of intense exchange between culturally distinct regions. It is now recognized that these interactions, far more than simple transfers of goods, shape the identity of societies in the Middle Bronze Age. Religious rites blend, architecture draws from diverse influences, and local leaders gain prestige by wearing exotic adornments. For Levantine powers like Mari, Byblos, or Ugarit, it is about maintaining and expanding their diplomatic networks at a time when competition between Mesopotamian and Anatolian cities is intensifying. The Minoans, proud of their naval superiority, strive to maintain good relations with Egypt while absorbing new techniques through contact with the Levantines. As for the groups established along the Adriatic, they begin to seize the opportunities offered by this distant trade while preserving defensive and village traditions inherent to their Dinaric or pre-Alpine environment. The Castellieri culture bears witness to this slow integration process, sites perched facing the sea, in discreet yet persistent connection with the flows of amber and metal. The trade routes taken by Syro-Canaanite or Minoan navigators are no longer limited to paths directly connecting Crete, Cyprus, and the Levant. They now venture towards the Adriatic, and by extension, connect populations that, a few centuries earlier, remained relatively isolated. The exchange is not only economic, it also has political and cultural repercussions, as funeral rites evolve, artistic styles merge, and naval construction techniques are shared. Maritime dynamics thus make the Mediterranean a fluid space, crossed by ships of various sizes, whose holds sometimes contain several tons of merchandise. In this universe, diplomacy is not an abstract concept. It is a daily practice, anchored in the negotiation of cargoes, the drafting of tablets, detailing with precision the quantities of wine, oil, tin, or copper loaded aboard. On the eastern coast of the Adriatic, small natural ports also become the scene of occasional trade exchanges, sometimes organized according to specific rituals, presentation of offerings, shared meals, meetings between local chiefs and foreign merchants. Much later, underwater excavations would reveal shipwrecks loaded with bronze ingots or raw materials, testifying to the logistical complexity of the routes. In inland regions, connected by wide river valleys, we find deposits of metal objects carefully buried, which perhaps served as reserves or commercial stock. Archaeology suggests that regional gold is not yet widespread, as it is mainly reserved for the wealthiest elites and circulates more in the Aegean and Anatolia. At the same time, in Syro-Canaan, the use of the cylinder seal, a small engraved stone piece rolled over clay, is spreading, facilitating commercial standardization and the authentication of goods. The various protagonists of this period, whether kings of Mari, governors of Byblos, administrators of Ugarit, Minoan dignitaries, or chiefs of Adriatic citadels, participate in structuring a vast interaction system in which mutual trust and regularity of transits prove essential. The risks of attack by bands of marauders or the breaking of alliances due to dynastic rivalries remain real. Yet, the prosperity that settles around 1900, 1700 before Christ in the Levant, Crete, and part of the Adriatic proves that a form of balance has been established. Local powers benefit from these connections as much by the symbolic prestige of possessing exotic goods as by the military advantage offered by new bronze weapons. Many tablets from Syrian or Mesopotamian palaces emphasize the hospitality offered to foreign emissaries, proving that negotiation is often accompanied by codified diplomatic acts. Through these multiple maritime or land corridors, Baltic amber circulates further than previously thought. Scientific analyses conducted on beads and pendants clearly identify their Nordic origin, indicating a structured trade well before the classical era. Metals, on the other hand, travel in the opposite direction, from the Mediterranean to more remote lands. The Castellieri culture, in contact with these transits, gradually integrates new foundry techniques and enriches its craftsmanship. Local pottery, initially crude, gradually adorns itself with decorations inspired by foreign influences, while the construction of cyclopean walls in some forts aligns with the defensive practices observed in Greece or Western Anatolia. Local populations do not merely endure these flows, they actively participate in them, supplying pastoral resources, salt, or even their maritime workforce. In this great mosaic, local elites, whether residing in a Cretan palace or a Levantine citadel, seek to expand their influence by cultivating distant alliances. Diplomatic gifts, such as the alabaster bowl offered to the Egyptians, illustrate the symbolic value of exchanges and emphasize the interest sparked by Minoan art and culture. In a context where commerce dictates power, possessing exotic objects goes beyond mere ostentation. It is proof of belonging to a network of states capable of influencing regional politics. The tablets of Mari and Ugarit also show that some barter agreements include defensive clauses, committing the partners to assist one another in case of a common threat. Political alliances and economic exchange thus work hand in hand, consolidating the scope and density of the Middle Bronze Age Mediterranean routes. Over the last centuries of this period, around 1700 before Christ, political transformations and climatic shocks began to shake this system, but the movement of interconnection did not abruptly cease. The flow of luxury goods such as Baltic amber, Cypriot copper, or Anatolian tin remained in circulation, albeit subject to new negotiations. Archaeological remains in the Castellieri cultures, discovered over the course of excavations, continue to prove that connections with the Aegean basin and the Levant remained very much alive. The crafting of jewelry adorned with amber beads or some Minoan symbols engraved on bronze suggests the continued desire to innovate, exchange, and combine styles. Local craftsmanship draws from multiple inspirations, and the Adriatic geographical position serves as a bridge between Central Europe, the Italian peninsula, and the Eastern Mediterranean. By the 16th century before Christ, the Eastern Mediterranean world saw the emergence of new centers of power, transforming the political and commercial dynamics that permeated the region. The Mycenaean citadels, located on the Greek mainland, capitalized on the cultural and technological heritage of the Minoan civilization, which had already established vast exchange networks in the Aegean Sea. At this time, the production of bronze, combining copper and tin, developed intensely and supported the economic expansion of the Mycenaean palaces. Mycenae, one of the main strongholds, is surrounded by Cyclopean walls reputed to be impregnable. Pylos, another prominent center, stands near the southwest coast of the Peloponnese. Behind these ramparts, the elites firmly manage agricultural and artisanal production, establishing a centralized redistribution system. The Linear B tablets, a writing system derived from Minoan Linear A, are used to record the inflow and outflow of products, as well as the corvée duties imposed on the population. Imbued with power and prestige, the Mycenaean rulers are buried with sumptuous objects, including the famous gold funerary masks, like the one attributed to the hypothetical Agamemnon. These extremely elaborate goldsmith pieces testify to the metallurgical mastery that characterized the entire Mycenaean sphere. Further north, the Hittite Empire was taking shape in the region of central Anatolia. Established around the capital Hattusha, a fortified site located at the current site of Boğazkale in Turkey, this power gradually consolidated. The Hittites, who used a cuneiform script adapted to their own Indo-European language, became one of the great powers of the Near East. They extended their influence into Syrian territories, sometimes entering into conflict with the kingdoms of Mitanni or even with Egypt. According to the Hittite tablets, the court of Hattusha produced legal, religious, and diplomatic texts, reflecting the importance of central administration. The Hittite sovereigns, holders of titles conferred by tutelary deities, primarily sought to strengthen their authority over peripheral territories. They established key fortresses to monitor trade routes used by caravans carrying tin, gold, and other precious goods. The metallurgy of bronze also flourished in this region, and Hittite blacksmiths maintained close relations with those from the Levant. Large temples were also built, dedicated to pantheons blending original Hadean deities and gods adopted through contact with conquered regions. Marital alliances with other major kingdoms further strengthened Hattusha's place on the international stage. In the 13th century before Christ, Hittite influence reached its peak as its monarchs confronted Egypt for control over Syria and Palestine. The climax of these rivalries took place at the Battle of Kadesh in 1274 before Christi, pitting Pharaoh Ramses II against the Hittite king Muwatalli-Tekke. Although the outcome of the confrontation remains disputed, this clash led to the signing of a peace treaty often considered the first formal bilateral diplomatic document in history. Written in two versions, one in Egyptian hieroglyphs, the other in Hittite cuneiform, this text established provisions for non-aggression and mutual cooperation, particularly to counter possible external threats. Because of this treaty, the two powers established a precarious balance in the Levantine region, providing greater security for trade exchanges. Caravans could then move more freely, transporting horses, metals, and various goods through the corridors linking Anatolia, Syria, and the Nile Valley. The depiction of Ramses II holding the hand of the Hittite king on mural representations would convey to future generations the prestige associated with this innovative agreement and the mutual recognition of two great empires. Parallel to these rivalries, a multinational network emerged, often referred to as the Club of Great Kings. It gathered the major powers of the Near East and the Aegean, such as Egypt, the Hittite Empire, Babylon, and sometimes the Mycenaean kingdoms. At the heart of this system, exchanges were meticulously regulated, sending embassies, specialized craftsmen, princesses destined for diplomatic marriages, and even doctors to heal foreign courts. Precious cargoes of gold, tin, and luxury items circulated by land and sea, nourishing a thriving trade. In the royal archives, there are records of injunctions to respect dignitaries sent by allied courts. For example, a renowned blacksmith might be requested to craft a prestigious weapon, while an Egyptian scholar is invited to examine a sick prince in distant Anatolia. Kings also exchanged letters to congratulate each other on a victory or complain about border incidents. In Mesopotamia, scribes meticulously recorded each transaction, reinforcing mutual trust. These interactions, although motivated by political interests, established a relatively peaceful climate, allowing the development of artisanal and commercial activities throughout the eastern Mediterranean. At the same time, Hittite chronicles mention the existence of a kingdom called Ahiawa, identified by many scholars as a term for the Achaeans, that is, the Mycenaeans. The kings of Hattusha thus exchanged diplomatic tablets with this maritime kingdom, which likely controlled several citadels in the Aegean. In these documents, one sometimes observes references to Wilusa, a place some equate with the Homeric Troy, famous in Greek tradition for the mythical Trojan War. Although the historicity of this conflict remains debated, it seems likely that clashes regularly occurred between the coastal communities of Anatolia and the Mycenaean forces eager to establish footholds in Asia Minor. Seals referencing the king of Ahiawa suggest that there was a mutual recognition between this Aegean state and the Hittites, granting the Mycenaeans a certain diplomatic legitimacy. The texts describe negotiations related to the release of exiles or the treatment of prisoners, indicating relations that were sometimes tense, but also sought dialogue. In collective memory, the Trojan War would be magnified by the tales of Homer, drawing on local legends, oral testimonies, and scattered fragments of real events rooted in the tumult of the 13th century before Christ. During the same period, Egypt experienced a phase of renewal under the New Kingdom dynasty, initiated around 1550 before Christ E, after the expulsion of the Hyksos. The pharaohs of the 18th dynasty, such as Amenhotep III or Akhenaten, established a centralized state capable of maintaining powerful armies and initiating grand architectural projects. Thebes, the seat of the cult of Amun, shone with the construction of monumental temples like that of Karnak. On the diplomatic front, these rulers also exchanged letters and gifts with their counterparts in Mesopotamia, Anatolia, and the Levant, as evidenced by the Amarna tablets. Exploiting the turquoise mines of Sinai and importing cedar from Lebanon fueled the royal economy, while Egyptian artisans produced gold and semi-precious stone jewelry exported to foreign courts. Egyptian military campaigns reaching the eastern shores of the Mediterranean ensured access to tributes and encouraged the recruitment of foreign mercenaries. Under Ramses II, the peak of the New Kingdom was marked by a significant presence in Nubia and the Levant, while leading to tight diplomatic negotiations with the Hittites. Multiple inscriptions attest to the Egyptian pride in these external successes. On the Greek mainland, the Mycenaean rulers consolidated their hold by perfecting the palatial economy based on rigorous administration. The Linear B tablets found at Pylos, for example, provide valuable information on the organization of labor, taxation, and the production of goods. Scribes recorded the distribution of land, the collection of wool or grain, and the allocation of daily rations. The palaces maintained workshops of craftsmen tasked with producing military equipment, such as bronze armor or light chariots, essential for wartime expeditions. Imports of gold and tin were carefully documented, while agricultural surpluses allowed for the provisioning of merchant ships. By sea, the Mycenaeans procured raw materials from the Aegean islands or the Anatolian ports, Navigation, however, remained risky, and archaeological artifacts excavated from shipwrecks, such as that of Uluburun, testify to the variety of goods transported: copper ingots, ivory, resins, jars of wine. In this cosmopolitan world, the Mycenaeans adopted some innovations inherited from the Minoans, notably the art of fresco and the tradition of fine pottery. The monumental citadels, adorned with richly decorated gates, were symbols of wealth and power, maintaining dominance over most Aegean territories. At the beginning of the 13th century before Christ, the Mediterranean world, once flourishing notably due to maritime trade networks, faced a series of crises that precipitated the collapse of the Bronze Age. From 1200 BRS before Christ onwards, various natural calamities occurred almost simultaneously, heightening the vulnerability of the great kingdoms and coastal cities that depended on stable commercial flows. Across a vast geographical arc, from Anatolia to Egypt, climate changes manifested notably. Archaeological evidence indicates more pronounced aridity, which reduced agricultural production in the Near East, prompted population movements, and made palace provisioning difficult. Successive droughts exhausted grain surpluses, while earthquakes destroyed several major settlements. The outlook was darkened by these natural factors, but internal social and political tensions also played a crucial role. Numerous inscriptions recovered from cuneiform tablets suggest that revolts in vassal provinces multiplied. The authority of the rulers, already weakened by famines, struggled to contain island and mainland populations in search of resources. In this uncertain context, where food shortages and dwindling abundant metals prevailed, the once essential trade routes remained threatened and frequently interrupted. The most spectacular consequence of this negative spiral lies in the sudden collapse of several powers that had dominated the international scene over previous centuries. The Mycenaean palaces of mainland Greece in fortified citadels like Mycenae, Pylos, or Tiryns suffer the same fate. They are burned, looted, or abandoned following internal conflicts and waves of invasions. In the east, the Hittite Empire, whose capital, Hattusha, once stood proudly in central Anatolia, also disintegrates. Contemporary records report that repeated incursions affect resources, and a sequence of short-lived rulers accelerates fragmentation. Diplomacy, once crucial for maintaining a balance among great kingdoms, breaks down. No one can guarantee the collective protection of strategic routes for the circulation of copper, the tin essential for making bronze, and other precious commodities. Coastal cities that were once prosperous, such as Ugarit or Imar in Syria, disappear from the map in flames. On the Levantine coast, Byblos or Tyre try to adapt, but trade is disrupted, and there is a notable decrease in the obsidian trade, the volcanic glass, highly prized for making tools and luxury items. Panic spreads throughout the eastern basin as international coordination dissolves. In this context, the systematic looting of tin routes, a crucial resource for bronze metallurgy, also occurs. Tin sometimes came from distant regions, which merchants had taken centuries to identify and integrate into their network. Now, these routes are targeted by armed bands or ships that no longer hesitate to seize entire cargoes, causing an alloy shortage in the once renowned workshops of Anatolia and the Levant. The palace fires, noted especially in Pylos, Hattusha, and Ugarit, testify to the violence of these incursions. Many fortifications prove insufficient in the face of combined assaults from invaders, both internal and external. Commemorative steles and tablets found suggest that internal tensions combine with external pressures. Officers launch mutinies, local petty lords seek to profit from the general disorder, and insecurity increases on land and at sea. The sudden disappearance of the obsidian trade is also a striking indicator of the irreversible decline of pre-existing networks. This rock, extracted among other places on the Aegean Islands or in Anatolia, traveled as far as Egypt and sometimes beyond. Its circulation, which required well-organized and protected routes, almost completely ceases around 1200 before Christ, reflecting the extreme fragility of the Mediterranean economic sphere. In this general collapse, the emergence of the Sea Peoples remains one of the most striking phenomena. The modern denomination of these groups, based on the rare Egyptian and West Semitic documents, encompasses various contingents of migrants, mercenaries, or invaders, who, in successive waves, sweep over the eastern coasts. Their exact nature remains debated, but it is likely that these populations were composed of warriors in search of new lands and resources, mixed with entire families fleeing devastated regions. The Egyptians, under the reign of Ramesses III at the beginning of the 12th century before Christ, described these groups as formidable adversaries, well-organized and equipped with war chariots. Among these peoples, the Peliset, identified retrospectively with the Philistines of the Bible, are often mentioned, as well as the Cheker, the Shekelesh, and the Chardons, who could be the origin of the name Sardinia in the western Mediterranean. The accounts also mention fleeting alliances between these different contingents, increasing the confusion among the kingdoms trying to defend against them. At each landing, they ransack port cities, capture grain stocks, plunder temples, and force many populations to flee inland. The permanent establishment of the Philistines in Palestine illustrates the lasting impact of these coastal migrations. Mainly located in the southern coastal plain region, they settled in 5 major cities, often referred to as the Philistine Pentapolis: Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gath. Archaeological remains show a Mycenaean material influence, evident, for example, in the so-called Philistine pottery, with patterns and manufacturing techniques reminiscent of those from the Aegean. The resulting cultural upheaval sees the emergence of new forms of rites, weaponry, and architecture. The local peoples, including the Canaanites, have to deal with these intruders, sometimes negotiating treaties, sometimes retreating. Further west, other maritime contingents occupy Sicily and Sardinia. Historians propose a connection between the Shekelesh and the Siculai, a people that marked the island of Sicily at the beginning of the first millennium before Christ, while the Chardons or Sherdon are often associated with Sardinia. In these regions, one notices the appearance of new funerary practices and the proliferation of so-called megalithic fortifications, a sign of profound transformation in insular societies. The impact of these migratory waves on the equilibrium of the Western Mediterranean is considerable, prompting long-term political and economic recompositions. The Medinet Habu Stele, erected under Ramses III, provides one of the most explicit testimonies concerning these sea invaders. Located in Thebes, Upper Egypt, this gigantic iconographic and hieroglyphic inscription describes the pharaohs' victorious campaigns against enemies threatening Egypt's eastern and northern borders. It depicts scenes of naval and land battles where Egyptian troops, supported by archers and infantry, repel the assault of the enemy fleet. The reliefs show destroyed chariots, captured warriors, and migrant families captured or fleeing, accompanied by cattle and carts. The texts indicate that these peoples, after ravaging the Nile Delta, were largely defeated thanks to the defensive strategy of Ramses III's troops, reinforced by a network of fortifications and carefully prepared logistics. The stele also emphasizes the diversity of the opposing groups and their presumed aggressiveness. The iconography compares their ships, clothing, and headdresses, highlighting the cultural heterogeneity of those whom the Egyptian court considers a common threat. At the time, this military achievement was celebrated as a new triumph, reminiscent of Ramses II's past victories, but did not restore the long-term world order as it once was. While the pharaohs of Egypt managed to contain these maritime assaults, the overall balance remained broken in most of the Mediterranean basin. Cumulative destructions, the scarcity of obsidian or tin networks, and migrations weakened the political and economic infrastructure. Mycenaean palaces do not recover. The Hittite civilization disappears, giving way to a mosaic of Anatolian entities, and Canaanite cities come under the influence of new kingdoms or nascent Phoenicia. Displaced populations, such as the Philistines in Palestine, the Seculi in Sicily, or the Chardans in Sardinia, upset cultural balances. There is a decline in the number of written documents. Linear B script and Hittite cuneiform largely disappear. International exchanges of luxury items, such as Egyptian scarabs to Greece or Anatolian goldsmithing, diminish. Local communities turn towards a more autonomous economy, less reliant on distant imports. In certain regions, rare enclaves still endure thanks to their natural fortifications, but geographic isolation is not enough to preserve commerce and know-how for long. Cultural traditions persist mainly in local pottery practices or in the oral transmission of epic tales celebrating a bygone past. In the early 11th century before Christ, the eastern Mediterranean was slowly emerging from the upheavals that marked the end of the Bronze Age. The great Mycenaean citadels, once flourishing on the Greek mainland, had been abandoned or destroyed. With them disappeared the use of Mycenaean writing, called Linear B, which had allowed the recording of palace inventories, lists of diplomatic gifts, and various commercial transactions. Deprived of a centralized administration, Greek communities fragmented and retreated into more modest villages, often perched in more easily defendable areas. The rich tholos tombs, characteristic of the Mycenaean era, were no longer built, marking a profound change in funeral customs as well as in the perception of power. In this context of demographic retreat, a technological innovation was gradually making its way: ironworking. Originating in Anatolia, where blacksmiths began experimenting with new bloomery techniques, iron spread in stages, slowly forcing the abandonment of bronze for many everyday uses. Iron objects did not immediately exhibit the quality and brilliance of bronze artifacts, but iron ore was abundant and accessible in several regions, and its handling eventually improved. Greek artisans adopted this resource, which came to supplant bronze for the manufacture of spearheads, knives, and axes. At the same time, a new artistic style was emerging in pottery, the so-called geometric pottery. Its name evokes the presence of strict and angular designs, often organized in horizontal registers. The broken lines, meanders, and triangles reflect a taste for symmetry and visual rhythm, in clear contrast with the figurative scenes of the late Bronze Age. Although writing seems to have disappeared in this Dark Age Greece, the tradition of decoration was maintained thanks to itinerant potters who conveyed and renewed techniques of turning and firing. At the same time, on the eastern shores of the Mediterranean, the Phoenician cities of Tyre and Sidon went on the commercial offensive. Engaged since the end of the second millennium in the trade of textiles dyed with purple obtained from murex shells, they also stood out by inventing and spreading a strictly consonantal alphabet. Simpler and more practical than the cuneiform systems of Mesopotamia or the Egyptian hieroglyphs, this new set of symbols comprised around 20 signs that chained together from right to left. Phoenician merchants and navigators exported their alphabet to other coastal regions, where it was sometimes adapted to include vowels, as would later be the case in Greece. Tyre and Sidon also extended their influence by founding trading posts and colonies. Among these was Utica, in present-day Tunisia, sometimes considered one of the oldest Phoenician settlements in North Africa. The caravans and ships dependent on it participated from then on in the Phoenician commercial boom around the Mediterranean. From Utica, it was easy to reach the islands of the western Mediterranean and to ensure the connection with the Iberian Peninsula, rich in minerals. The so-called Archaic period, which extends approximately from 750 to 550 before Christ, marks a stage of profound upheavals in the eastern and central Mediterranean. At that time, the Greek world, until then composed of city-states with still budding political organization, began a maritime expansion that would redraw the map of the Mediterranean basin. Demographic pressures, the rise of commerce, and the search for fertile lands prompted many city-states to found colonies. This movement, called the Great Colonization, was deployed mainly towards southern Italy and Sicily, where prosperous Greek establishments would appear. The coastal lands, once inhabited by indigenous populations, underwent deep political and cultural transformations. Cities such as Syracuse, founded in 734 before Christ by Corinthian settlers, soon became imposing urban centers, comparable to some city-states on the Greek mainland. At the same time, the Phoenicians, already active in the east, developed their own colonial networks, contributing to the creation of a true mesh of exchanges and influences throughout the Mediterranean. In Magna Graecia, the name used by the Romans to designate these Hellenic colonies in the south of the Italian peninsula, prosperity goes hand in hand with the emergence of innovative local institutions. Taranto, founded around 706 before Christ by Spartans, perfectly illustrates this phenomenon. Initially conceived to relieve mainland Greece from demographic overflow, it quickly develops its own identity, favored by the richness of its territory and the vitality of its exchanges. The massive arrival of colonists alters the social and political balance, leading to a phenomenon called syncretism, which means the merger of different settlements or villages into a single urban entity. In some cities, the rise of strongmen, often supported by the people, leads to the emergence of tyrannies, forms of government in which an individual concentrates significant powers, sometimes to the detriment of traditional elites. This new political framework, although unstable, nevertheless stimulates cultural and military innovations that spread throughout the region. Simultaneously, ancient indigenous populations, like the Iapygians or the Sicels, have no choice but to coexist or relocate, thus durably transforming the ethnic map of southern Italy. In Sicily, the Archaic period witnesses the rise of flourishing cities such as Syracuse, traditionally founded by Corinthians, led by the oikist Archias. It benefits from a favorable natural site, equipped with a well-sheltered harbor and fertile lands in the immediate vicinity, which explains its rapid growth. Syracuse soon establishes itself as a leading power in the western Mediterranean. Its commercial activities, supported by navigation and skilled artisans, allow it to acquire considerable political influence over the island. Other colonies emerge, such as Gela, founded by Rhodian and Cretan colonists around 688 before Christ, or Acragas Agrigento, established from Gela in the 6th century before Christ. These new urban centers quickly rival local powers, notably the Elymians and the Sicanians, indigenous groups with ancient traditions. The arrival of the Greeks, bringing exchanges and confrontations, introduces new gods, new funerary practices, and an unprecedented architectural model, later exemplified by the famous Doric temples of the Valley of the Temples in Agrigentum. This vibrant context consolidates the image of Sicily as a meeting place between different peoples, a catalyst for political and cultural transformations with lasting repercussions. While the Greeks turn westward, the Phoenicians continue their maritime expansion on the other side of the Mediterranean basin. Coming from the Levant, specifically from city-states such as Tyre and Sidon, these seasoned navigators have already established multiple stops on the islands and African shores. Towards the late 9th century before Christ, one of their most famous settlements is founded, Carthage, located in the northeast of present-day Tunisia. According to legendary tradition, the Phoenician queen Elissa, or Dido, founded the city after fleeing Tyre. Carthage experiences rapid growth thanks to the strategic position of its port on the trade routes linking east and west. The Phoenicians also established Gadir, which is now Cadiz in Andalusia, making the Iberian Peninsula a key territory for the extraction and export of precious metals such as silver and copper. The maritime role of these colonies is reinforced by what some authors call the Kushite fleet, referring to the naval potential and alliances concluded with various regional peoples. The Phoenician ships, renowned for their solidity and maneuverability, sail the seas in search of new trading posts, creating a dense network of exchanges upon which many emerging powers will rely. One of the major transformations of the archaic era concerns the way war is conducted within the Greek city-states. The appearance of the hoplite, a heavily armed infantry soldier equipped with a round shield called a hoplon, a spear, and a bronze cuirass, revolutionizes military tactics. Instead of scattered and individualistic fights, the phalanx formation unites tightly packed ranks of warriors who advance in a coordinated manner. This discipline, requiring meticulous cohesion and common training, strengthens the solidarity among citizen soldiers and alters the balance of power between the aristocracy and the people. At the same time, the invention or generalization of the trireme, a warship with 3 rows of oars arranged in a staggered formation, provides the Greeks with a formidable maritime tool. A trireme has about 170 rowers, capable of maneuvering the vessel with unmatched power and speed for the era. The prows, often reinforced, allow breaking the enemy's hull with a frontal collision, a tactic that will become decisive in future naval battles such as Salamis. Both the phalanx and the trireme symbolize the new face of war and power, where collective discipline prevails over individual exploits. If war and the founding of colonies shape Greek identity from the 8th century before Christ onward, the city-states also seek to channel their rivalry through more peaceful practices. The Pan-Hellenic sports competitions appear as one of the most effective means to maintain cohesion and forge a common sentiment. The first Olympic Games, traditionally dated back to 776 before Christ, are an emblematic example of this desire to transcend political divisions between the cities. Held in the sanctuary of Zeus at Olympia, in the Peloponnese, these contests include several disciplines: foot races, wrestling, boxing, pentathlon, and chariot racing. Winners enjoy immense fame, not only personally, but also for their home city, which gains considerable prestige. Beyond the sporting aspect, these meetings also have diplomatic stakes, as cities sometimes sign sacred truces to allow athletes, judges, and spectators to travel safely to Olympia. In a world often marked by violence, the staging of peaceful competition contributes to the idea of a pan-Hellenic identity, cemented by language, religion, and the cult of heroes. In this context, it is important to emphasize the diplomatic role played by the Pan-Hellenic sanctuaries, beyond just hosting competitions. At Delphi, the Oracle of Apollo attracts delegates from across the Mediterranean. Kings or tyrants, in search of legitimacy or advice, consult the Pythia before launching a colonial expedition or making a strategic decision. The sumptuous offerings that adorn the temples testify to the power and generosity of the rulers, while affirming the cultural unity of the Greek world. At the same time, other sanctuaries such as that of Zeus at Dodona, famed for its sacred oak, play a similar role in affirming a shared identity. This religious diplomacy is combined with the need for emerging cities of the West to ensure the moral and spiritual support of Athena, Apollo, or other deities. Thus, the flow of pilgrims and sacred processions reinforced the cohesion of a vast geographical area, which, despite its political divisions, recognizes itself in common symbols. The new Greek foundations in the Western Mediterranean are also accompanied by major economic developments. Trade exchanges are booming, with ships carrying a variety of goods, ranging from wheat and olive oil to metals, wine, ceramics, and luxury items. Greek artisans, specialists in pottery and sculpture, create new decorative styles, such as proto-geometric and geometric art, before evolving into more naturalistic forms. The rise of maritime trade encourages the creation of storage and redistribution networks in ports, where true merchant elites establish themselves. In this dynamic, naval equipment, already perfected by the war trireme, adapts to cargo transport. Larger ships, sometimes originating from shipyards in Asia Minor, traverse the Mediterranean to connect the cities of mainland Greece, Magna Graecia, Sicily, and even the Phoenician Levant. This dense network of maritime connections ensures a rapid diffusion of goods and ideas, promoting the emergence of an increasingly integrated Mediterranean civilization. In parallel, the internal structuring of archaic cities continues to evolve. Social tensions, arising from the unequal distribution of wealth and the inequitable sharing of land, fuel the emergence of tyrannical regimes in several cities. In Corinth, the Bacchiadae family is overthrown around 657 before Christ by Cypselus, who then hands power to his son Periander. These tyrants, though criticized by aristocrats excluded from power, modernize their cities. They encourage the construction of monumental buildings, finance the arts, and facilitate economic development. Public projects, like the famous Diolkos of Corinth, a land path allowing ships to slide from one gulf to another, testify to their intent to endow the city with prestigious infrastructure. In Sicily, figures like Phalaris of Acragas, or later Gelon, and Hieron of Syracuse will strongly mark regional history, imposing their authority sometimes violently, but often ensuring a certain stability. By the middle of the 6th century before Christ, the Achaemenid Persian Empire, founded by Cyrus the Great, emerges as an unmatched power east of the Greek world. The expansion process of this dynasty begins around 550 before Christ, when Cyrus, ruler of Persia, defeats the Medes and unifies the Iranian territories under his authority. This political entity soon extends over a wide geographical arc that includes Lydia, a country rich in gold, and then Babylonia, where Cyrus makes a triumphant entry in 539. Before Christ, under these successive reigns, the Persian Empire takes on an administrative structure novel for its time, based on satrapies, regional governorates, led by officials loyal to the great king. Each satrapy is required to collect taxes, provide troops, and maintain local order, while allowing the conquered populations relative cultural autonomy. To centralize power and facilitate the flow of information, the Achaemenids established the royal road linking Susa to Sardis, which crosses Asia Minor through relays where messengers quickly replace their mounts. Thanks to this network, the king receives dispatches and provisions in a short time, thus ensuring effective oversight over his vast territories. In this spectacular political configuration, the Greek cities of Ionia, located on the shores of Asia Minor, fall under Persian control and lose their autonomy. This domination, nevertheless, stimulates exchanges between Persian civilization and the Hellenic world, as Greek merchants continue to export their goods along the shores of the Aegean Sea. Cultural and economic tensions, however, eventually escalate, leading, around 499 before Christ, to the outbreak of the Ionian Revolt. Temporarily supported by Athens and Eretria, another Greek city on the island of Euboea, this uprising is violently suppressed by the Persians, providing Darius III, successor to Cambyses, with a pretext to intervene directly in the Greek world of Europe. After the Persian victory over the rebels, Darius decides to organize a punitive expedition against Athens, which he holds responsible for having aided the Ionian insurgents. In 490 before Christ, this expedition crossed the Aegean Sea to land on the plain of Marathon near Athens. According to the tradition reported by ancient historians, the ensuing battle established the tactical superiority of the Athenian hoplites. The Persians, less accustomed to hand-to-hand combat in such conditions, yielded to the heavily armed Greek infantry. Athens emerged victorious from this foundational confrontation, securing an invaluable reputation and a precious sense of invincibility. It is also from Marathon that the legend of the messenger running to announce the victory to the city originates, an episode often reinterpreted as the origin of the modern race, called the Marathon. Beyond the symbolic significance, this success does not definitively curb imperial ambitions. Darius the Fadari died in 486 before Christ, but his son and successor Xerxes inherited the project of subjugating the Greeks. He then undertook to gather a vast army, including contingents from several satrapies, to march against the Hellenic cities. Between 480 and 479 before Christ, a series of confrontations, known as the Persian Wars, shook the entire Greek world. At the pass of Thermopylae in 480 before Christ, the Persians were slowed by the heroic resistance of a small contingent led by the Spartan king Leonidas. Although vastly outnumbered, these fighters strove to block Xerxes' army, giving the allied cities a respite to organize their defense. Despite Leonidas' defeat and the Persian breakthrough, this episode symbolizes bravery. In the wake of this, Xerxes seized Athens, from which the majority of the population had fled to seek refuge on the island of Salamis. In these narrow waters, the Greek fleet, led by Themistocles, set a trap for the heavy Persian ships. The naval battle of Salamis in 480 before Christ ended with a decisive Greek victory based on the mobility and coordination of their triremes. The Persians, despite their numerical superiority, struggled to maneuver in this tight strait and suffered heavy losses. Xerxes then chose to retreat, leaving part of his army in Greece, which would be defeated the following year at the Battle of Plataea in 479 before Christ. These successive defeats put a halt to the Persian advance, temporarily boosting the Greeks' confidence in their ability to defend their lands. Among the cities that contributed to this victory, Athens emerged in a position of strength. Following the Persian Wars, the Athenians formed the Delian League, a military alliance with other island and coastal cities of the Aegean Sea, with the objective of continuing the fight against the Persians and ensuring naval security. Members of the League paid financial contributions to Athens, allowing the city to acquire an imposing fleet. Quickly, Athens transformed this alliance into a maritime empire, using the resources thus collected to increase its military power, embellish the city, and reinforce its political influence. The unification of these cities under Athenian leadership and the dominance exerted by the city over its allies became subjects of discord, pushing some cities to turn away from Athens and consider Sparta as a strategic counterbalance. Sparta, meanwhile, stood as the great terrestrial rival of Athens. Organized according to an oligarchic and militaristic system, the Lacedaemonian city built its reputation on the discipline of its hoplites and the rigor of a demanding Spartan education focused on training for combat. The disparity between the two political systems, Athenian and Spartan, is reflected in their respective diplomacy. The Athenians value direct democracy, where free citizens participate in assembly decisions, while Sparta maintains kings and a council of elders, ensuring the stability of a traditional order. The opposition between these two great Greek powers would culminate in the major conflict called the Peloponnesian War, which began in 431 before Christ. During this long war, marked by periods of truce and intense resumption of fighting, the Greek world is divided into two camps: the Delian League, dominated by Athens, and the Peloponnesian League, led by Sparta. The Athenians rely on their naval superiority and hope to block the enemy by ravaging the Peloponnesian coasts, while Sparta, strong in its infantry, tries to devastate Attica to deprive Athens of its agricultural lands. A tragic turn strikes the city of Athens in 430 before Christ, when an epidemic, known as the Plague of Athens, spreads within the walls, worsened by the overpopulation related to the gathering of villagers inside the fortifications. This plague kills about a third of the population, including Pericles, the strategist and main political leader of the city. This disaster significantly weakens Athens, which struggles to regain the cohesion necessary to defeat determined enemies. In this context, Spartan military communication relies on the cityle, a system for transmitting encrypted messages. The cityle is a stick around which a leather or parchment strip is wound, on which letters are written in line. Once unwound, the sequence of characters becomes incomprehensible to anyone who does not possess a stick of the same dimension. This device illustrates the Spartans' ability to perfect their intelligence tactics while remaining very close to external influences. On their side, the Athenians launched numerous debates in the Ecclesia, the People's Assembly, to decide on military strategies, vote on naval budgets, or judge those responsible for any failures. This direct democracy, of which the orator Pericles was one of the symbols, is nourished by an intense intellectual life. Philosophers, architects, and playwrights interact with political leaders, sometimes influencing collective decisions. After several decades of conflict, the Peloponnesian War ends in 404 before Christ with the capitulation of Athens. Sparta triumphs militarily, but Greece emerges generally weakened. As Sparta attempts to exert its hegemony, it faces resistance from other cities such as Thebes, which briefly assumes a predominant role before exhausting itself in turn. Fratricidal struggles persist, undermining the balance of all the cities and leaving the Greek space vulnerable to the ambitions of a rising power, Macedonia. Although this evolution is already the extension of the classical era towards the advent of Macedonian power, it is prepared in the margins of this world, divided by internal rivalries. Over the course of the 4th century before Christ, Greece thus finds itself in a complex situation, shared between the memory of past glory against the Persians and the lasting aftermath of inter-Hellenic civil war. Meanwhile, the classical period sees the emergence of a remarkably rich thought, whose echoes cross the centuries. On the philosophical level, Athens hosts major figures such as Socrates, probably born around 470 before Christ, who tirelessly questions the ethics and virtue of his fellow citizens. Although he leaves no written works, his influence becomes known through his disciples, foremost among them, Plato, founder of the Academy, who records his master's teachings in the form of dialogues. Aristotle, a student of Plato, active around the middle of the 4th century before Christ, embodies another facet of this effervescence. Founder of the Lyceum, he is interested in various fields such as politics, metaphysics, biology, and logic, thus laying the foundations for multiple intellectual disciplines. Around 336, before Christ, Macedonia, a kingdom then considered relatively peripheral compared to the older great Greek powers, was about to take a central place in the history of the Mediterranean and beyond. The assassination of Philip II of Macedon, father of Alexander, abruptly changed the political situation in Greece. As soon as Alexander, then about 20 years old, ascended the throne, he inherited a seasoned army, forged by the campaigns orchestrated by Philip II against neighboring city-states. Determined to consolidate Macedonian hegemony, Alexander first set out to suppress revolts in Greece. Thebes, one of the major Boeotian cities, which defied his authority, was defeated and razed to serve as a warning. The other cities quickly realized that the young king was a formidable strategist, which strengthened Alexander's role as a military and political leader. To unite the Greeks, he secured recognition for a pan-Hellenic project of revenge against the Persian Empire, an ancient enemy of the Greek peninsula. This rallying cry allowed him to transcend certain traditional divides and lead everyone into the largest conquering expedition the ancient world had known. In 334 before Christ, he crossed the Hellespont, today's Dardanelles Strait, to begin the advance eastward. He first won the Battle of the Granicus in May 334, where his tactical skill surprised the Persian generals. The Greek cities of Asia Minor, previously subject to the satraps of the Achaemenid Empire, enthusiastically liberated themselves and regarded Alexander as a liberator. The Persians, who had seemed invincible for decades, were shocked by the speed and dynamism of this Macedonian army. Alexander perfected the famous phalanx, supported by the companion cavalry, and implemented exemplary coordination between different units to destabilize a much more numerous opponent. As the reputation of the new king spread, he engaged in a series of symbolic and political operations intended to reassure local populations, whose alliance he sometimes sought. In 333, before Christ, the direct confrontation with Darius III, the great Persian king, took place near Issus, in the southeast of Anatolia. The Macedonian victory was resounding. Darius III fled, leaving his family at the mercy of Alexander, who chose, however, to treat them kindly. This shrewd decision earned him a reputation as a just conqueror. Then, in the autumn of 332, after a grueling siege, Alexander captured Tyre, a powerful Phoenician city famed for being impregnable. The fall of Tyre opened the road to Egypt, then a Persian province for decades. The Egyptians welcomed Alexander as a liberator and proclaimed him pharaoh in Memphis, around the end of 332 before Christ. He respected local traditions by maintaining a royal pharaonic cult and founded a new city bearing his name on the Mediterranean coast, Alexandria. On marshy grounds, the city was designed to become a major maritime and river crossroads. Macedonian engineers planned canals leading to the Nile, and the urban layout adopted some Greek characteristics: a main street at right angles, public buildings, various temples, and an exceptional natural harbor. From its inception, Alexandria was conceived as a future center of international exchange and a place of knowledge. In 331, before Christ, Alexander turned towards Mesopotamia, resolved to defeat Darius III once and for all. At Gaugamela, not far from Arbela, he faced an imposing Persian army. Yet, thanks to the discipline of the phalanx and the maneuvers of the Macedonian cavalry, Alexander won decisively. Darius III, in flight, was assassinated by his own officers shortly after, leaving the field open to the victor. Entering as a conqueror into Babylon, then Susa and Persepolis, Alexander sealed the end of the Achaemenid Empire. At Persepolis, he ordered, in a highly symbolic gesture, the burning of the royal palace, which he presented as revenge for the Persian invasion of Greece more than a century earlier. However, he later supported the reconstruction of several sites and made Babylon one of the major centers of his administration. He proclaimed himself the legitimate heir of the Achaemenids, adopting several Persian rites like proskinesis, a mark of reverence before the king, which irritated some of his veterans. This evolution in his manners embodied his desire to unite under his authority Greek traditions and Eastern customs. He intended to rule his empire by reconciling multicultural elites, convinced that a tolerant approach would facilitate acceptance of his domination. The campaign then extends into Central Asia. Alexander attacks Bactria and Sogdiana, present-day territories of Afghanistan, Uzbekistan, and Tajikistan, crosses the Hindu Kush, and fights battles to conquer fortresses perched at high altitudes. He marries Roxana, a Sogdian princess, and encourages his Macedonian officers to form unions with local women in order to create new bonds of loyalty and establish a coexistence of mixed elites. This policy raises some discontent among the Macedonian veterans, who are less inclined to accept the deep integration of foreign traditions into the circle of power. However, Alexander remains determined to consolidate his authority over these remote lands. In 327 before Christ, he leads an expedition to the Punjab in present-day northwest India. He confronts King Porus on the banks of the Hydaspes, today the Jhelum, and despite the war elephants, he triumphs once again. However, the fatigue of his troops becomes increasingly apparent. The soldiers, fearing the prospect of venturing further east, refuse to cross new unexplored mountains. Disappointed, Alexander agrees to turn back. The return journey through the Indus Valley and the Gedrosian Desert remains arduous. Thirst, diseases, and local insurrections put his contingents through a harsh test. He nevertheless manages to bring his units back to the major cities of Mesopotamia, where he strives to structure a multicultural empire. He already plans a campaign in Arabia, and perhaps even further, when he dies in Babylon in June 323, before Christ at the age of 33. His sudden death leaves a vast empire with unclear succession, precipitating a series of wars among his generals, now known as the Diadochi. The dismemberment of the empire happens quickly. The Diadochi vie for his territories, initially proclaiming as kings his official heirs, Philip III Aridaeus, Alexander's half-brother, and the young Alexander IV, the posthumous son of the conqueror. Yet, effective power falls into the hands of these former Macedonian officers. After prolonged conflicts, three great dynasties eventually established themselves: the Lagids, or Ptolemies in Egypt, the Seleucids in Asia, and the Antigonids in Macedonia. The founder of the Lagid dynasty, Ptolemy I Soter, makes Alexandria his capital, erecting numerous buildings and developing institutions promoting Greek research and culture. In Egypt, he declares himself pharaoh but strives to maintain local religious traditions. Egyptian priests are integrated into the state apparatus, while the Greek administrative vision takes root, fostering economic development. Under Ptolemy II, the illustrious Library of Alexandria is constructed, designed to gather a unique corpus of texts, attracting scholars from all over the Mediterranean basin. In the east, Seleucus I Nicator acquires a vast territorial ensemble encompassing Syria, Mesopotamia, and part of Anatolia, even extending into Central Asia. To administer these immense kingdoms, he relies on Greek cities and allows certain Persian structures to subsist, reorganizing the satrapies with a Macedonian touch. Antioch, located near present-day southern Turkey's Orontes, becomes his main seat of power, while other foundations or urban renewals consolidate the Greek presence at the fringes of the former Persian Empire. The Seleucids, often in rivalry with the Lagids, maintain a prestigious court inviting artists, architects, philosophers, and astronomers. In the west, in Macedonia, the Antigonid dynasty asserts itself. After prolonged battles, it ensures its domination over the Macedonian historical heartland, and, to a lesser extent, over certain recalcitrant Greek cities, which must cope with this monarchy to maintain relative autonomy. Tensions are not uncommon, but the hallmark of the era remains the widespread diffusion of Greek culture throughout Alexander's former empire. The period known as the Hellenistic era begins with a powerful cultural fusion. The common Greek language, or koine, spreads and serves as the medium of communication, making exchanges between diverse populations possible. Local elites in Egypt, Syria, or Anatolia eventually partially adopt Greek values, education, and aesthetics. Meanwhile, Greek rulers, aware of the contributions of the conquered traditions, maintain collaborations with Egyptian priests, Babylonian scholars, or Iranian elites, aiming to collect taxes and stabilize their kingdoms. This era witnesses the founding of significant libraries, notably in Alexandria, Pergamon, or Antioch, each aspiring to surpass the others in the quantity and quality of works. Art experiences the influence of this cosmopolitanism. Painting and sculpture diversify, reflecting the tastes of a courtly society. Sovereigns have themselves represented in busts, large or small, thus adopting the practice of portrait currency, a symbol of personalized royalty. Where former Greek cities minted effigies of gods or civic symbols, these kings no longer hesitate to imprint their faces on silver or gold, imposing their presence on a Mediterranean scale. Among the monumental symbols of this era, the Lighthouse of Alexandria holds a special place. Erected on the island of Pharos, it was envisioned during the reign of Ptolemy I and completed under Ptolemy II, possibly around the middle of the 3rd century before Christ. The structure, built of white stone, stands at an estimated height of over 100 meters, making it one of the tallest architectural marvels of antiquity at the time. Fires fueled by combustible materials guide ships at night, while its successive tiers impart a distinctive silhouette. According to chroniclers, there might have even been a system of mirrors reflecting light during the day. Moreover, the Lighthouse of Alexandria is reputed to have become one of the first buildings, if not the first, to impose a mooring fee on ships wishing to approach the port. It seems that the payment demanded by the Lagid authorities contributes to the maintenance and operation of this vital structure for Mediterranean navigation. The goal is to make Alexandria the principal hub of maritime commerce, linking Greece, Phoenicia, Cyprus, and, through a network of inland routes and canals, the Upper Nile Valley, as well as the paths to the Red Sea. The trade of grains, papyrus, spices, and luxury goods from Africa or Asia bolsters the wealth of the Lagid dynasty. Beyond Egypt, the cultural influence of the Hellenistic period is felt throughout the great metropolises, from Pergamon to Rhodes, including Antioch. The expansion of the Greek language allows for the circulation of scientific, philosophical, and literary works that inspire new syntheses. Astronomers like Aristarchus of Samos, mathematicians like Euclid or Archimedes, poets like Callimachus or Theocritus find in this multicultural universe a fertile ground. The adoption of coinage bearing the sovereign's profile contributes to an economic unification movement via a relatively stable monetary standard. Kings use monetary propaganda to assert their legitimacy, sometimes distributing coins commemorating victories or dynastic events. Artistic style evolves compared to the classicism of the preceding era. Expressiveness is sought, themes of daily life are explored, and local deities are sometimes magnificently Hellenized. In certain cases, the deep collaboration uniting Greek elites and indigenous traditions gives birth to hybrid religious forms. Thus, in Ptolemaic Egypt, the worship of Isis spreads to the eastern Mediterranean, as the Egyptian goddess seems more accessible in her Hellenized representation. Brand new sanctuaries are erected to honor deities with mixed identities, bringing together Greek and non-Greek devotees in the same worship. Sovereigns, eager to demonstrate their piety, sponsor these cults and use their religious status to consolidate their power. In Asia, several Seleucid satrapies integrate an iconographic repertoire combining Persian, Greek, and Mesopotamian symbols. The Antigonids, on their part, place Macedonia and Greece under a regime that recognizes certain traditional institutions, such as autonomous cities, while exercising political control through garrisons and marital alliances. The Diadochi and their successors, while regularly contesting territories, managed to maintain a certain prosperity throughout the Hellenistic world, fostering the circulation of ideas, goods, and populations. This context is made possible by the heritage of Alexander, whose rapid conquests created a lasting bridge between the West and the East. Although political unity breaks after 323 before Christ, cultural, scientific, and commercial effervescence endures. The Greek coin facilitates exchanges between people who were previously separated, and the sovereign's currency, bearing his likeness, circulates from the Aegean Mediterranean to Central Asia. Libraries, notably that of Alexandria, pride themselves on gathering a multitude of scrolls written in various languages, translated or annotated by scholars. The Lighthouse of Alexandria, a symbol of this era, illustrates the alliance between Greek engineering and the privileged geographical situation of Egypt. Its practical role of securing port access and levying mooring taxes adds to its prestigious dimension. It embodies the power of the Lagid kingdom, now rivaling all other monarchies born from the imperial fragmentation. Politically, successive generations of Macedonian sovereigns follow Alexander's example. They seek to legitimize their power by associating Greek tradition with respect for local cults and customs, and by imposing their image down to the smallest economic transactions. Towards the 5th century before Christ, Carthage, located on the North African coast in present-day Tunisia, comes to the forefront of the Western Mediterranean. Founded according to tradition by Phoenicians from the city of Tyre, the city rises to the rank of a merchant power thanks to its strategic location. Carthaginian navigators sail the sea to establish trading posts and exchange exotic goods. Ancient texts report that the city gradually takes control of the trade of precious metals from Iberia. Copper, silver, and even tin, so precious for making bronze, then arrive in abundance at its quays. Carthage's wealth does not stem solely from metals. The purple dye, extracted from seashells called murex, constitutes one of its most prized luxury products. After a complex treatment, this rare dye adorns fabrics destined for the elite throughout the Mediterranean basin. Concurrently, garum, a sauce obtained by macerating salted fish, is exported to many ports. The Carthaginians also developed centers for the exploitation and processing of agricultural products, notably olive oil and wine, which circulate in stamped amphorae, evidence of the commercial flows connecting Africa, the Balearics, and the Iberian Peninsula. Politically, Carthage is distinguished by an oligarchic system led by magistrates called suffeti. Elected from among the great families, they preside over the assembly and oversee the management of the city's affairs. Major decisions often require the approval of the Council of Elders, composed of influential notables. Religiously, Carthage venerates Baal Hammon, the supreme god associated with fertility and the protection of the community. In certain sanctuaries called tophets, archaeological excavations have uncovered funerary urns, evidence of rites dedicated to these tutelary deities. The cults also integrate Tanit, Baal's consort. During the first half of the 5th century before Christ, Carthage confronts the ambitions of Syracuse, a Greek city-state established in Sicily. The two powers vie for control of maritime routes and access to the island's grain supplies. Intermittent conflicts result in several decisive battles, including the one at Himera around 480 before Christ, where the Carthaginians suffer a serious setback. Despite this defeat, the African city doubles its efforts to assert its hegemony. The Carthaginians strengthen their coastal positions and forge alliances with certain local populations, while renewing trade from their sometimes distant Sardinian and Iberian outposts. In the 4th century before Christ, the rivalry with Syracuse is rekindled several times. Under the Carthaginian generals Mago, Himilco, and later Hanno, various military campaigns aim to consolidate Punic influence in Sicily. The successive sieges of Syracuse often meet with the fierce resistance of the Greek rulers, including Dionysius the Elder. Despite some fleeting victories, Carthage struggles to definitively subdue the island. Nevertheless, Carthage's maneuvering room remains considerable on the economic front, as the routes to southern Italy, Sardinia, and Gaul retain their vitality. Punic Iberian merchants also extend their networks to the Atlantic coast. Relations between Carthage and Rome likely date back to the early 5th century before Christ, as indicated by a treaty mentioned by ancient authors. For a long time, the two powers are content to ensure their respective spheres of influence. Carthage dominates the western seas, while Rome extends its control in Italy. However, as Rome strengthens its authority over the Italian peninsula, frictions multiply, particularly around Sicily. In 264 before Christ, Rome's military occupation of Messina marks the starting point of the First Punic War. This conflict inaugurates a long series of bloody and destructive confrontations. During the First Punic War, Rome and Carthage primarily clash at sea, each seeking to deprive the other of supplies. The Carthaginians boast a strong naval tradition, but Rome quickly adapts, developing imposing fleets and the famous corvus, a boarding bridge. After a series of naval battles, including the one at Ecnomus, the outcome is decided near the Aegates Islands in 241 before Christ. The Roman victory forces Carthage to abandon Sicily, now a Roman province, and to pay heavy indemnities. This defeat stokes a desire for revenge among many Carthaginians eager to ardently reclaim their lost influence. To compensate for the loss of Sicily, Carthage turns to the Iberian Peninsula, rich in silver and human resources. Under the leadership of Hamilcar Barca, and then his son-in-law Hasdrubal, the Carthaginians established new settlements, including Cart Hadasht. They gradually subjugate local tribes and intensively exploit the mines, arousing Rome's concern. Upon Hasdrubal's death, Hannibal, son of Hamilcar, inherits the command. According to tradition, he swore to hate Rome and seek revenge. In 219, before Christ, Hannibal's capture of Saguntum, an ally of Rome, triggers the Second Punic War with significant consequences. In 218 before Christ, Hannibal embarks on a daring expedition, crossing the Alps with his war elephants and a substantial contingent. His advance surprises the Roman armies, which suffer heavy defeats at the Trebia, Lake Trasimene, and especially at Cannae in 216 before Christ. Rome panics, but finds resources by massively mobilizing its Italian allies. While Hannibal camps close to the capital, the Roman Senate organizes a defense. Gradually, the Carthaginian forces become exhausted in Italy. The Roman general Scipio, later dubbed Africanus, counterattacks in Iberia, cutting off Carthage's rear bases. Faced with this direct threat, Carthage recalls Hannibal to defend its African territories. In 202 before Christ, the The Battle of Zama pits the Carthaginian army against Scipio, who employs ingenious tactics to neutralize the elephants. Despite his experience, Hannibal fails to reverse the course of the confrontation. Carthage's defeat leads to the end of the Second Punic War in 201 before Christ and the imposition of drastic conditions, the abandonment of the war fleet, the payment of significant tributes, and the loss of control over the Iberian Peninsula. After this trauma, the city nevertheless manages to quickly recover economically. Despite the restrictions imposed by Rome, Carthage becomes a prosperous center again, focused on commerce and agriculture. This resilience arouses hostility from some Romans, including Cato the Elder, who regularly concludes his speeches in the Senate with the phrase, Carthago delenda est. In his view, the economic power of Carthage threatens Rome's supremacy. In 149 before Christ, a diplomatic pretext triggers the Third Punic War. Carthage fiercely defends itself behind its walls during a 3-year siege. In 146 before Christ, the city succumbs to the final assault, sealing the disappearance of this age-old rival in the Mediterranean world. After the First Punic War, Carthage faces a revolt by its own mercenaries. Deprived of their pay due to the enormous indemnities demanded by Rome, these troops, consisting of Libyans, Iberians, and other groups, rise against the very city they defended. This mercenary war lasts from 241 to 238 before Christ and severely tests the new Carthaginian authorities. Hanno the Great, tempted by negotiation, and Matho, leader of the rebels, engage in a relentless struggle. Eventually, Carthage manages to crush the rebellion, but this crisis weakens its financial resources. Carthage's military organization is based on a mixed army consisting of wealthy citizens serving as officers and foreign contingents recruited from allied or subjugated peoples. This diversity gives the city the ability to project power, but sometimes complicates cohesion in combat. Carthaginian generals, however, possess solid experience, forged in conflicts against Syracuse and in the mercenary war. The Carthaginians also demonstrate innovation, whether in the construction of siege engines or the tactical use of elephants. Their engineers, active in the military ports, spread coveted technological knowledge throughout the Mediterranean region. The commercial prosperity of Carthage is reflected in its coinage, primarily in silver, used to pay its troops and facilitate international trade. Often depicted is the effigy of the goddess Tanit, the city's protective symbol, or the image of a horse, a reminder of Punic military strength. Revenues from Iberian mines and taxes on goods also fuel urban development programs. In Carthage itself, the military port, called the Chthon, displays architectural ingenuity. Designed with 2 circular basins, it allows for rapid rotation of ships, a further sign of Carthaginian naval power. As the city strengthens its defenses and forms various treaties in the Western Mediterranean, Rome perceives this resurgence as an affront. Supporters of confrontation in Rome denounce the emergence of a Punic countermodel capable of rivaling the Senate. Despite a minority of senators in favor of diplomacy, tensions remain high. Carthage, on its part, cautiously negotiates new agreements while keeping informed about Roman fleet movements. Some historians note that this period of relative peace also benefits the Sicilian economy, as trade between Carthage and several island cities is maintained or even flourishes significantly. The end of the 3rd century. Before Christ marked a crucial point for the Roman Republic, which had just emerged from the ordeal of the Punic Wars against Carthage and found itself able to direct its expansionist ambition eastward. Around 200 before Christ, Rome already controlled the majority of the Italian peninsula and had forged a formidable reputation among Mediterranean powers. The republican institutions, with their 2 annual consuls, the Senate sitting on the eminent capital, and the popular assemblies regrouping citizen soldiers, then began to envisage a new political order. While the Carthaginian threat waned, the eastern Mediterranean was dominated by various kingdoms, resulting from the fragmentation of Alexander the Great's empire. Among these entities were Macedonia, still powerful, and the Aegean League in Greece, anxious to preserve its autonomy. The opportunity for the Romans to extend their influence to these territories became irresistible. The conquest of Greece took place in successive stages. First, Rome intervened in Macedonian affairs to contain the ambitions of King Philip V, who was considered a threat to Rome's allied cities, particularly Pergamon and Rhodes. After several military campaigns conducted with discipline and tenacity, the Republican armies managed to push back Philip V and impose a first form of protectorate over part of mainland Greece. Shortly thereafter, the defeat of Antiochus III, the Seleucid ruler, at the battles of Thermopylae in 191 before Christ and Magnesia in 189 before Christ gave the Romans even greater access to Anatolia. Finally, the most decisive episode occurred in 146 before Christ, with the destruction of Corinth, a symbol of Hellenic resistance. This prosperous city, known for its craftsmen and maritime trade, was razed as retribution for a final revolt, definitively marking the inclusion of Greece within the Roman sphere. After subduing Greece, the Romans turned their attention to Asia Minor, a region corresponding to present-day Western and Central Turkey. The diplomatic ties, already established with some Anatolian cities like Pergamon, facilitated Roman establishment. Pergamon, due to its pro-Roman policy, was first made a client kingdom before being bequeathed by its last sovereign, Attalus III, to the Roman Republic in 133 before Christ. The Senate formalized this transfer by creating the province of Asia in 129 before Christ, administered by a propraetor or a proconsul. This new territorial entity quickly became a hub of trade in the Aegean Sea, thanks to its numerous ports like Ephesus and Miletus. Flows of slaves, grain, and manufactured goods transited abundantly, consolidating the Republic's wealth and ensuring the Senate an influential position throughout the eastern Mediterranean basin. The local elites, often willing to collaborate, gradually adopted Roman customs. Parallel to these eastern campaigns, Rome was increasingly moving closer to Ptolemaic Egypt, then governed by the Greek dynasty stemming from one of Alexander's generals. Egypt was of paramount strategic importance due to its immense reserves of grain, capable of feeding the growing Roman population. Over the decades, the Senate had forged fluctuating alliances with the Ptolemaic rulers, attempting to maintain political balance while benefiting from the largesse of this wealthy kingdom. The decisive turning point came during the civil wars opposing Julius Caesar to the senatorial party, at which time Cleopatra VII, the last queen of the dynasty, allied with Caesar to secure her throne against her brother Ptolemy XIII. Later, Mark Antony, Caesar's lieutenant, also found an ally in Cleopatra, which aroused the suspicion of Octavian, the future Augustus. After the naval battle of Actium in 31 before Christ, Octavian defeated the forces of Mark Antony and the Queen. In 30 before Christ, Egypt definitively came under Roman control, becoming Octavian's personal province, which he managed through prefects appointed directly. Control of Egypt ensured a regular supply of grain and conferred an unprecedented position of strength on Rome in the region. However, This rapid expansion was also accompanied by numerous internal disturbances, notably illustrated by the reforms of the Gracchus brothers. Tiberius Gracchus, tribune of the plebs in 133 before Christ, sought to redistribute part of the public lands to the poorer citizens to curb the agrarian crisis. Army veterans, in particular, often found themselves without means of subsistence after their campaigns. The senatorial oligarchy fiercely opposed this, fearing a destabilization of the established order. Tiberius was assassinated on the steps of the Capitol, and his brother Gaius met the same fate a few years later, in 121 before Christ. These tragedies revealed deep social fractures and foreshadowed the unrest that would lead to the end of the Republic. The Servile Wars, the most famous of which was led by the gladiator Spartacus between 73 and 71 before Christ, further highlighted the growing tension between elites and displaced populations. The figure of Julius Caesar emerged in this tumultuous context. An ambitious general from an old patrician family claiming descent from the goddess Venus, he first distinguished himself through his conquests in Gaul between 58 and 50 before Christ, further expanding Roman control. Returning to Italy, Caesar crossed the Rubicon in 49 before Christ with his legions, an illegal move that triggered a new civil war. Victorious over Pompey, another eminent general, Caesar appointed himself dictator for life in 44 before Christ. Although brief, his government launched major reforms, such as the adoption of a new calendar known as the Julian and the foundation of colonies for his veterans. However, the Roman aristocracy saw in his monarchical ambitions a threat to republican traditions. Caesar was assassinated on the Ides of March in 44 before Christ by a group of senators led by Brutus and Cassius, plunging Rome into internal struggles between supporters and opponents of the late dictator. Among Caesar's political heirs, a relatively discreet young man emerged, Octavian, the nephew and adopted son of the late general. Supported by the popularity of Caesar's name and by a shrewd strategy of alliances, Octavian formed a triumvirate with Mark Antony and Lepidus to avenge the assassins of his adoptive father. After the Battle of Philippi in 42, before Christ against the Republican armies of Brutus and Cassius, the triumvirate divided the Roman world. Mark Antony then administered the east from Alexandria, where he formed an unbreakable bond with Cleopatra. Octavian, based in Rome, gradually dismantled Lepidus's influence and prepared for the final confrontation with his colleague. Octavian's victory at Actium in 31 before Christ marked the end of Mark Antony's authority and that of his Egyptian partner. A few years later, Octavian was granted the title of Augustus by the Senate, meaning the revered one, and established the Principate, a hybrid regime maintaining the illusion of a republic while concentrating power in the hands of the new princeps. Under Augustus, the Republic gave way to a form of veiled monarchy, where the emperor stood as the guarantor of peace and prosperity. Officially, the Senate retained a consultative and symbolic role, but everyone knew that the ultimate authority rested with Augustus. It was at this time that the Mediterranean began to be referred to as Rome's Mare Nostrum, reflecting national pride as much as an economic and military reality. The provinces were reorganized, some directly under the emperor's control, others still depending on the Senate. Armies stationed at the borders defended fortified lines along the Rhine and Danube, while the sea was patrolled by Roman fleets ensuring the security of maritime transport. Revenue from provincial taxes funded large infrastructure projects, such as roads, aqueducts, and public buildings, further unifying the Mediterranean basin. This system, despite its fragilities, offered relative stability that Rome had not experienced in decades of civil war. At the heart of these exchanges, Alexandria in Egypt occupied a prominent position. The second largest city in the empire in terms of population, it was renowned for its library, its schools of philosophy, and its commercial prosperity. Ships regularly departed from Alexandria, laden with grain and other goods, heading towards Ostia, the main port serving the city of Rome. It is estimated that several 100,000 tons of grain arrived this way each year to feed the inhabitants of the capital. This intense maritime traffic required ships suited to the high seas and capable of transporting large cargoes. In this context, Roman engineers developed a technical innovation known as the culina naval. It was an arrangement allowing crews to safely and efficiently preserve and cook provisions on board. Some cargo galleys equipped with reinforced hulls could reach a capacity of around 1,000 tons, ensuring a vital link between Egypt and the Italian peninsula. At the beginning of the 1st century, Anno Domini, the Roman Empire entered a period of relative political and military stability that modern historians will call the Pax Romana, an imperial peace that extends approximately from the advent of Augustus in 27 before Christ until the last years of Marcus Aurelius's reign in 180 Anno Domini. This era of 2 centuries sees the strengthening of central powers and the consolidation of a vast territory linking the entire Mediterranean basin, as well as vast regions of Western Europe, North Africa, and the Near East. Despite some sporadic unrest, internal conflicts are less frequent than in previous periods, and the Roman army, strong with its battle-hardened legions, largely ensures the security of land and sea communication routes. Thanks to this climate favorable to exchange, the economy, culture, and beliefs spread on an unprecedented scale, connecting diverse populations who increasingly share common points while preserving their local specificities. In this vast ensemble, one of the fundamental pillars is the road network, which would total around 80,000 kilometers of roads arranged for imperial travel, troop transport, and trade. A typical Roman road is characterized by a stone foundation covered with a layer of gravel, then basalt slabs or local rock, designed to withstand the test of time. Roman engineers, relying on expertise inherited from Etruscan and Greek techniques, emphasized the solidity and straightness of the routes. Throughout the empire, there are milestones indicating distances, and sometimes mentioning the name of the emperor who financed the construction or restoration of that route. The staging posts and mansions, sorts of inns placed at regular intervals, offer lodging and food to travelers, merchants, and officials. Official couriers, with imperial passes, can thus cover long distances in record time for the period, ensuring quick communication between Rome and the provinces. This land network is accompanied by an equally vital set of maritime routes. Merchant ships tirelessly crisscross the Mediterranean, often called Mare Nostrum by the Romans, which means our sea. The relative peace prevailing in the Mediterranean basin allows ship owners to charter cargoes of wheat, oil, wine, metals, or pottery. Trade routes also carry luxury products, silk spices from the east, marble from Greece, precious stones from Egypt, or Arabia, items prized by the Roman elite and synonymous with prestige. To secure these maritime routes, the empire relies on the Classis Romana, the Roman military fleet, tasked with hunting down potential pirates still present, escorting strategic convoys, and intervening in case of coastal insurrection. Major ports, such as Ostia, the port of Rome, or Alexandria in Egypt, are equipped with basins fitted with lighthouses, solid docks, and large warehouses. These facilities facilitate the transshipment of goods and ensure a continuous flow of essential resources to the capital, where nearly 1 million inhabitants must be fed and supplied daily. In this context, several port cities stand out as true models of urban planning and economic dynamism. Pompeii, located on the Bay of Naples in Italy, is certainly not a major port like Ostia, but it nonetheless benefits from its proximity to the sea and serves as a striking example of the prosperity of a provincial city. Its paved streets, houses adorned with colorful frescoes, and public buildings, forums, temples, baths, amphitheater testify to a comfortable standard of living for many of its inhabitants. The patrician villas surrounding the city produce wine and oil intended for export, not to mention local fishing and crafts. This prosperity abruptly ends in 79 Anno Domini, when the eruption of Vesuvius buries Pompeii and neighboring cities under ash and pumice. Ironically, this disaster preserves to this day an almost intact sample of daily Roman life in the 1st century, offering archaeologists and historians a unique testimony on the housing, social composition, and religious practices of a typical aggregation of the empire. Further east, in Asia Minor in present-day Turkey, Ephesus stands out as an essential metropolis. Its port, open to the Aegean Sea, sees a considerable volume of goods from the Near East, and the interior of the Anatolian lands pass through. The city also prides itself on being the site of the Temple of Artemis, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, whose size and magnificence fascinate travelers. Under Roman rule, Ephesus equipped itself with infrastructures reminiscent of the great imperial cities: spacious baths, colonnaded streets, the monumental library of Celsus, inaugurated in the 2nd century, and a semicircular theater that could accommodate several thousand spectators. Thus, Ephesus became an influential intellectual and cultural center, where Greeks, Romans, Jews, and the local population of Lydian descent met. This convergence of populations fueled an artistic and religious effervescence that reflected one of the defining features of the Pax Romana: cultural plurality within a relatively unified political framework. On the coast of present-day Libya, Leptis Magna occupies a key position in Mediterranean and Saharan trade. Of Phoenician origin, the city flourished during the early centuries of the imperial era, notably thanks to the trade of cereals, olive oil, and slaves coming from the African hinterland. Its port was modernized under the reign of several emperors who saw this city as a strategic stronghold for trade relations with the interior of the continent. Expansion works, jetties, and storage infrastructures gradually appeared. The Latin language and culture eventually blended with local traditions and the Punic heritage, offering a concrete example of how Romanization imposed itself while incorporating pre-existing cultural elements. Archaeologists have uncovered remarkable ruins there: monumental arches, forums, baths, and civil basilicas where public affairs were conducted. Later, Leptis Magna would become famous for being the birthplace of Emperor Septimius Severus at the end of the 2nd century, who would invest heavily there. But already in the 1st and 2nd centuries, the prosperity generated by the Pax Romana was clearly evident. At the heart of this Pax Romana, there was also an extraordinary circulation of beliefs and religious practices. Rome had long been a breeding ground for local and imported deities, ranging from Jupiter to Juno to Minerva. However, as the empire expanded, new cults gained popularity. The cult of Isis, originating from Egypt, attracted many inhabitants throughout the Mediterranean basin. Dedicated to a protective maternal goddess, occasionally promising a form of personal salvation, this cult had countless followers in the western provinces, notably among women and sailors. Temples to Isis, called Issaria, sprang up from the Iberian Peninsula to the edges of Asia Minor. The ceremonies associated with this Egyptian deity included nautical processions and mystical rites, perceived as exotic and attractive by the Roman population seeking spiritual practices different from the traditional religion. cult of Mithras, probably of Iranian origin, also enjoyed widespread success, especially among soldiers stationed in the border regions of the Rhine and the Danube. It is believed that the initiatory dimension and the virile camaraderie characteristic of Mithraic rituals played a central role. Mithraea, these underground sanctuaries dedicated to Mithras, pinned at the heart of many garrisons, were secret places where the initiate progressed through various ranks before attaining full knowledge of the mysteries. Although this cult was never officially recognized as a state religion, it enjoyed implicit tolerance and took root in the major cities of the empire, reflecting the religious cosmopolitanism of the time. The Jewish presence in the empire is also significant. Historically, Judea was part of the territories conquered under Pompey in the 1st century before Christ. Jewish communities were then found throughout the Mediterranean basin, particularly in Egypt and Alexandria, in Mesopotamia, and in major cities on the Aegean coast. Although the second half of the 1st century Anno Domini was marked by a Jewish revolt against Rome, punished by the sack of Jerusalem and the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 Anno Domini, many communities remained dispersed and continued to prosper in the empire. They often enjoyed relative freedom of worship, despite occasional tensions in major cities. In Rome itself, several synagogues were frequented by worshippers from all social classes, a sign of a religious pluralism still uncommon in many other ancient civilizations. This mosaic of diverse beliefs, practices, and influences often leads to local syncretism, where Roman deities merge or associate with those of conquered peoples. Sometimes, a local god is assimilated to a Roman god, sharing similar attributes. The Greek healing god, Asclepius, for example, might be conflated with the Celtic god of medicine in the Gallic provinces, without these peoples seeing any contradiction. The emperors themselves are sometimes elevated to the rank of deities after their death, an imperial cult that continues the Eastern traditions of revering sovereigns. The temple dedicated to the Gens Flavia, built under Domitian in 8196 Anno Domini, represents in this regard a major symbol of the institutionalization of the imperial cult. For inhabitants of distant provinces, honoring the genius of the emperor becomes a way to demonstrate their loyalty to Rome, while reaffirming their local identity through the persistence of their own gods and rites. In cities like Pompeii, religious and cultural expression is reflected in numerous archaeological remains. Temples of Isis stand alongside those of Jupiter or Apollo, while mythological frescoes decorate the villas of notable individuals. Amidst these official monuments, one also finds a myriad of traces of everyday life. One of the most striking discoveries in the case of Pompeii is the astonishing quantity of graffiti reproduced on walls, columns, or shop facades. Many of these inscriptions are simple declarations of love, mockeries towards certain local personalities, or daily banalities. However, there are some that mention gladiator combats, an extremely popular entertainment in Roman society. Amphitheaters throughout the empire attracted large crowds, eager to cheer their champions or witness bloody confrontations between fighters sometimes from the other side of the world. Pompeian graffiti thus repeatedly mention illicit bets and predictions about the winner of an upcoming match. Far from being an exception, this practice of betting on gladiators was widespread and sometimes tolerated by the authorities, although some moralists were outraged by it. The phenomenon of games and spectacles funded by local notables is part of a subtle propaganda mechanism where organizing generous festivities enhances the popularity of the elites and showcases the glory of the city. Magistrates, sometimes keen on preparing a broader political career, did not hesitate to sponsor gladiator games or chariot races, especially when they aspired to establish their prestige among the people. The Romans were very fond of these competitions held in circuses or regional amphitheaters, For most inhabitants, particularly in distant provinces, these games were moments of social cohesion, entertainment, and escape from the daily toil of the countryside or workshop. The wall inscriptions found in Pompeii show supporters of this or that gladiator, sometimes writing mocking messages at the expense of the opponent's fans. This behavior almost mirrors the modern passionate engagement of current sports fans, eager to defend the honor of their champion. Beyond the allure of games, this era of the Pax Romana is also one of artistic flourishing. Statuary art is enriched by Greek influence, while mural painting reaches a high degree of refinement, augmented by techniques of perspective and illusionism. Mosaics adorn the floors of lavish villas, depicting both mythological scenes and episodes of daily life. Cultured elites often speak Greek as much as Latin, as Roman education places significant emphasis on Greek rhetoric and letters, regarded as models of intellectual refinement. Scholars from the Greek world even settle in Rome to showcase their knowledge to influential families, while architects and artisans from the eastern provinces travel to Gaul or Hispania to collaborate in the construction of new cities. This human mobility is largely fueled by the stability offered by the Pax Romana and contributes to the mingling of cultures, promoting the emergence of regional identities integrated into the empire without being completely homogenized. In this prosperous dynamic, internal peace supports economic expansion. The large agricultural estates, or latifundia, often belong to the senatorial or equestrian nobility, employing slaves and sometimes free workers. Wheat from Egypt and North Africa feeds Rome and the large Italian cities, while wine and oil produced in Hispania or Gaul are transported on ships specially designed for carrying amphorae. Artisans from Campania or Asia Minor produce ceramics in large quantities distributed throughout the Roman world. Across land routes and maritime connections, similar styles of pottery, oil lamps, or glassware are found in very distant cities, evidence of harmonized production methods. Commerce is structured around large marketplaces or forums, where transactions are concluded under the supervision of local magistrates. Taxes collected in money or in kind feed the imperial treasury while financing the maintenance of communication routes, the pay of legions, and the construction of new public facilities. This material prosperity contributes to the emergence of a class of provincial notables who adopt Roman customs and aspire for institutional recognition. Admission to the Senate, initially reserved for Italian elites, gradually opens to eminent provincials. Under Emperor Vespasian, and later under his successors, senators emerge from distant regions like Spain, as with the case of Trajan, who became Emperor Gaul or Syria. Roman citizenship rights gradually spread, allowing more inhabitants to participate politically in the life of the empire. Even if Rome remains the ultimate political and symbolic center, the notion of belonging to a common space gains ground. Populations subject to Roman laws become accustomed to resorting to courts and written law, which consolidates the legal administrative unity sought by the Flavian dynasty and later by the Antonines. Thanks to these multiple factors, the Roman Empire of the 1st and 2nd centuries presents a remarkably diverse face, uniting under the same political framework populations of varied ethnic, linguistic, and cultural origins. Cults circulate similarly to goods, and never has the Mediterranean been so intensely traversed. Syrian, Egyptian, and Greek merchants cross paths in ports, while Iberian travelers stay in the great citadels of Anatolia. Currency, minted with the effigy of the reigning emperor, circulates without barriers and facilitates common evaluation of goods. The maritime routes join those of the North Atlantic, where some products like tin from Britain, used in bronze making, or furs and cattle from Germania reach. In every major city, one finds a forum, a theater, baths, sometimes an amphitheater and temples dedicated to the gods of Rome or to exotic deities. This architectural homogeneity does not prevent the manifestation of regional specificities recognizable in the organization of neighborhoods, the shape of dwellings, and local ornaments. While Pompeii is often mentioned for its tragic fate, it is also through this city that we discover convincing evidence of the attraction to spectacles and the existence of sports betting related to gladiatorial combat. Excavations have revealed inscriptions mentioning slogans in favor of a charismatic gladiator or mocking the defeat of another, proving that the city was animated by a very intense public life. To these graffiti are added rudimentary drawings, sometimes describing the equipment of a gladiator, whether he is a retiarius, armed with a net and trident, a secutor wearing a smooth-visored helmet, or a thraex, holding a small shield and curved sword. The promoters of these combats, often identified by their name or public office, take advantage of the popular fervor to cement their notoriety. Bets are not only financial, some inhabitants become morally or emotionally invested behind their favorites, making the atmosphere at the shows electric. In these arenas, one could see the mingling of modest classes, attracted by the thrill of blood and challenge, and the affluent classes, enjoying more comfortable seats and boxes to display their power. The gladiator graffiti of Pompeii thus constitutes a central element for understanding the general enthusiasm for Roman entertainment during the Pax Romana. They provide a glimpse of a leisure culture that extends to all provinces. In the Western Empire, at Lugdunum, Lyon, or Tarraco, Tarragona, large games with parades of wild beasts, public executions, and legendary duels between famous gladiators are also organized on certain municipal or imperial festivals. In the eastern provinces, tastes may vary a little, but the fascination for gladiatorial combat eventually takes hold here too, although some Greek elites initially view these spectacles as barbaric. Over time, the empire comes to make these bloody days a moment of cohesion and expression of imperial power. It is Rome that finances or authorizes the games, and it is in the arenas that the power of the Roman people materializes, supported by the glory of the emperor. Just as the passion for gladiators unites men and women in the stands, the cults of Isis or Mithras, although different, spread to the point of inspiring a flurry of local adaptations. Isis is worshipped in sanctuaries where columns with Egyptian-style capitals are found, sometimes reinterpreted in the Roman fashion. Mithraea are installed under existing buildings or in underground galleries, capable of accommodating a limited number of worshippers and adorned with frescoes depicting the Tauroctony, Mithras sacrificing a bull. Far from being compartmentalized, Roman religious life operates on multiple levels, allowing a form of tolerance as long as public order and the emperor's authority are not challenged. During this peak period, the Pax Romana appears as an almost globalized system for its time, where ideas circulate as quickly as caravans and trade ships. The relative safety of the routes results in an upsurge of ancient tourism. Greek travelers venture into Egypt to admire the pharaonic monuments. Romans visit the Acropolis of Athens or the oracular sanctuaries of Delphi, and some Eastern notables travel as far as Gaul to oversee their affairs. Exchanges of knowledge cover medicine, astronomy, architecture, and even philosophy, as Athens remains the cradle of the Stoic, Epicurean, and Platonic schools of thought, regularly studied by the Roman elites. The central administration even encourages these flows, viewing the emergence of economically strong and culturally vibrant provinces favorably as a guarantee of better integration into the empire. Among the remarkable symbols of this policy of openness, we can mention the grandiose monuments erected to commemorate victories or showcase imperial power, triumphal arches, narrative columns, temples renovated in honor of the imperial cult. In the provinces, cities eager to embellish their urban space and demonstrate their loyalty to the emperor do not hesitate to compete with initiatives: restoration of public buildings, organization of civic festivals, dedications of altars. Local notables often use their fortunes, accumulated through maritime trade, grain commerce, or mining, to finance these projects, which ensure them a certain political and social visibility. In Ephesus, the Library of Celsus, erected in the 2nd century by the son of consul Tiberius Iulius Celsus Polymaianus, perfectly illustrates this phenomenon of patronage. Besides honoring the memory of Celsus, the building houses thousands of scrolls and constitutes a high place of intellectual life in the city. If we return to daily life, the artistic and religious effervescence combines with a growing interest in hygiene and well-being. Public baths, already present at the end of the Republic, multiply in all the provinces. Large complexes often include rooms heated to various temperatures: the frigidarium, cold room, the tepidarium, warm room, and the caldarium, hot room. Next to them, one finds the palestra, intended for gymnastics and other physical activities, as well as socializing spaces where regulars read, discuss, and exchange on daily affairs. The heating mode by Hippocaust, based on a system of air circulation under the floor, illustrates Roman ingenuity in architecture and comfort. The baths play a hygienic, social, and political role as they gather citizens from different classes who can form alliances or spread rumors. Towards the beginning of the 3rd century Anno Domini, the Roman Empire, then at its territorial peak, faces major upheavals that weaken its structure. Demographic crises, military instability, and a decline in central authority intertwine. The first signs of this turmoil appear with the so-called Plague of Cyprian, which arises around 249 and lasts more than a decade. According to the eponymous bishop, violent symptoms decimate populations, spread across the provinces, and compromise the economic balance of cities already strained by excessive fiscal burdens. The high mortality rate affects the armed forces as recruitment becomes difficult. In parallel, inflation spirals out of control. The gradual depreciation of the denarius, underway since the end of the 2nd century, accelerates under the growing pressure of military expenses and the need to support the affected regions. Barter networks resurface in some rural areas. The damage caused by the epidemic amplifies the empire's vulnerability to external pressures. The Rhine and Danube frontiers, guarantors of Roman security, are subject to frequent incursions by groups labeled as barbarians. These are not mere sudden invasions, but rather gradual penetrations and migrations initiated by different peoples, attracted by the material wealth and opportunities that the Roman space provides. Military posts, already under strength, struggle to stem these flows. The crisis-affected economy complicates the maintenance of fortifications. Internal revolts break out, and several provinces sometimes attempt to secede under the authority of local military leaders supported by their troops. The legions, arbiters of power, elevate ephemeral emperors, increasing instability at the top of the state. Corrective measures remain limited due to a lack of firm and lasting direction. The year 284 marks the rise to power of Diocletian, an officer of humble origins born in Dalmatia. Following numerous internal struggles, he realizes that the empire, too vast, cannot be governed effectively by a single man. He then creates the Tetrarchy, an unprecedented system that distributes authority between 2 Augusti and 2 Caesars. Diocletian retains control of the east and entrusts the west to Maximian, while Galerius and Constantius Chlorus designated as Caesars, support the two rulers. The idea is to better protect the borders while ensuring an orderly succession. Concurrently, Diocletian initiates a major administrative reform, increasing the number of provinces to better control tax collection and strengthen the presence of officials on the ground. He hopes to restore order, stabilize the economy, and halt the spiral of violence that has plagued the empire for decades. Aware of the gravity of inflation, Diocletian attempts to thwart speculation. In 301, he issues the Edict on Prices, setting a cap on many basic products such as wheat, wine, and oil, as well as on wages. The goal is to protect the population from abuses and prevent the monetary system from collapsing. However, in such a vast empire, the enforcement of the edict remains problematic. Smugglers multiply, and many communities struggle with the limitations, preferring to rely on bartering or black markets. Despite its limitations, this initiative illustrates the state's intent to exercise centralized control over a highly diverse economic fabric. Diocletian also conducts several censuses to better distribute the tax burden, even if it means relying on a heavy bureaucracy. The policy of imperial exaltation intensifies as the emperor adopts a quasi-divine regalia, breaking with the relative simplicity of the Antonines. After Diocletian's abdication in 305, the Tetrarchy collapses under the pressure of power struggles. Several contenders vie for power, backed by their troops and various senatorial factions. Constantine, son of Constantius Chlorus, gradually emerges as the most capable of restoring unity. In 312, he faces Maxentius near the Milvian Bridge at the entrance to Rome. According to Christian tradition, Constantine received a celestial sign before the battle, which would later strengthen his ties with the Christian religion. Victorious, he takes control of the imperial west and with Licinius issues the Edict of Milan in 313, establishing freedom of worship. Official persecutions cease, and the church can now organize openly. Its structures consolidate, with the emergence of influential episcopal seats in important cities like Antioch, Alexandria, and Rome. Constantine asserts himself as the sole emperor after defeating Licinius in 324. Eager to strengthen spiritual cohesion, he convenes the Council of Nicaea in 325 in present-day Turkey to address the Arian controversy and define a unified doctrine. The lively debates lead to the adoption of a creed, the Nicene Creed, which establishes the consubstantiality of the Father and the Son. Constantine sees this religious unity as a means to stabilize the empire, as an official faith accepted by the majority facilitates the harmonization of practices. In the same vein, he initiates a vast program of constructing churches and places of worship while supporting the clergy. Christians gain influence, now occupying key positions in the administration. Although not yet exclusive, the Christian religion becomes a major pillar of the imperial identity promoted by the sovereign. In 330, Constantine transfers the imperial capital to Byzantium, renamed Constantinople. Situated on the Bosphorus Strait, the city enjoys a privileged military and commercial position, linking Europe and Asia. Quickly fortified and adorned with monuments, it is designed to rival ancient Rome. The imperial residences, the hippodrome, and religious edifices testify to the desire to project a renewed power. The bishops of Constantinople gain increasing prestige, almost rivaling the Roman pontiff. In the eastern provinces, the imperial court establishes a solid administration, while the west remains more exposed to barbarian attacks. The rise of Constantinople symbolizes the shift of the center of gravity towards the east, where the wealth from Asia Minor, Egypt, and the Levant flows. The church plays an increasingly significant political role there, supporting the strengthening of a budding theocratic state. Despite these achievements, the empire remains fragile. Constantine's successors struggle to maintain the balance between East and West. Theological divergences, like Arianism, create internal tensions, and the disputes over imperial succession fuel instability. Emperor Julian, Constantine's nephew, unsuccessfully attempts to restore pagan worship between 361 and 363, arousing the suspicion of the established Christian elites. In addition, invasions continue in the north and east. The Goths, themselves pressured by the Huns, cross the Danube and sometimes settle as federates within the empire, hoping to find security in better lands. The borders become complex zones of exchange, where alliances and conflicts alternate depending on the circumstances. The reforms initiated by Diocletian and Constantine do not prevent the West from becoming impoverished, while the East maintains a certain economic dynamism thanks to its large cities and trade circuits. At the end of the 4th century, Emperor Theodosius I undertakes to consolidate Christianity as the dominant religion. Around 391, he bans pagan cults, closing temples and redirecting public practices toward the church. Doctrinal conflicts persist, however, and the Arian question still divides part of the episcopate. Militarily, Theodosius faces several rebellions, notably that of Magnus Maximus in the west, and negotiates with Germanic populations seeking legal status. The pressures on the borders continue, suggesting the empire's inability to sustainably contain migratory flows. In this context, the polycentric legacy left by Diocletian and Constantine fuels the growing rivalry between power centers. The Eastern administration, based in Constantinople, proves more stable, while the West is more often at the mercy of generals seeking to impose their authority on the emperor. In 395, upon Theodosius's death, the empire is definitively divided between his two sons. Arcadius takes the east, Honorius the west. While the idea of Roman unity theoretically persists, this division institutionalizes the duality that had been brewing for decades. In Constantinople, Arcadius inherits a more urbanized environment and a better organized administration. In the west, Honorius rules from Ravenna, considered safer than Rome, which would endure the sack by the Visigoths in 410. The financial resources of the East, fueled by the major cities of Asia Minor and Egypt, provide Arcadius with more means to maintain a solid army and bureaucracy. Conversely, the West struggles to raise sufficient taxes and must contend with the rise of barbarian leaders integrated into its ranks. The split is confirmed. On one side, the Eastern Empire, later called Byzantium, and on the other, the Western Empire, whose fall will be quicker. By the end of the 5th century, as the Western Roman Empire faces a major political crisis, new powers emerge dominated by army chiefs of Germanic origin. In 476, Odoacer, a Scyrian Heruli military leader, seizes power in Italy. He deposes the young emperor Romulus Augustulus, presented as the last Western sovereign, and sends the imperial insignia back to Constantinople, signifying the end of the imperial function in the West. This act is considered the symbolic date of Rome's fall, although the Roman administrative and economic structures partly persist as a form of institutional continuity. Odoacer then attempts to consolidate his local power by preserving certain inherited civic management mechanisms. Odoacer's decision to keep the Roman elites in place is not motivated by a desire for appeasement. It also stems from the complexity of the bureaucratic fiscal system, which he needs to establish his authority and collect taxes. The cities, traditionally governed by municipal councils, retain much of their magistracies, although the recruitment of officials is subject to the new power's approval. The large landowners, senators, and local notables remain influential as long as they agree to collaborate with this post-imperial regime. Symbolically, Odoacer presents himself as an administrator of Italy on behalf of the Eastern Emperor, whose recognition he seeks. This approach strengthens his political position. Despite this precarious stabilization, the arrival of new Ostrogothic armies alters the Italian balance. Theodoric, raised in Constantinople and familiar with Roman culture, receives the support of the Eastern Emperor Zeno to drive Odoacer out. When Theodoric crosses the Alps in 488, he seizes strategic cities. After confrontations, Odoacer capitulates and is assassinated in 493 at a reconciliation banquet. Theodoric then establishes himself as the sovereign of Italy, while recognizing a form of nominal allegiance to Constantinople. He seeks the support of the senatorial aristocracy by preserving the Roman Senate and respecting Roman law. Thus, the administration remains operated by officials trained in the Latin tradition. This continuity reassures the urban elites. Theodoric pursues a policy of openness towards other Germanic peoples settled in the West. Through diplomatic marriages and alliances, he seeks to consolidate a Gothic confederation linking Italy to the Visigoths established in Hispania under Alaric II until 507. In this context, Ostrogothic Italy becomes a commercial crossroads, with merchants transiting between the Western Mediterranean and the Alpine regions, while Roman craftsmen export their architectural skills. The local populations, Nicene Christians by tradition, coexist with the Aryan elite of the Ostrogoths, occasionally generating tensions. Nevertheless, Theodoric maintains a relative tolerance to preserve cohesion and ensure civic order. Meanwhile, North Africa sees the rise of the Vandal kingdom, established from 429 under Gaiseric. After crossing the Strait of Gibraltar, the Vandals seize the former province of Africa, of which Carthage becomes the capital in 439. Armed with their fleet, they control a crucial portion of the maritime routes. The Vandals, Arian Christians, govern a local Nicene population, sometimes creating disputes. Despite this, Carthage remains a major economic hub, exporting olive oil and wheat to Italy and the Mediterranean islands through a still dynamic trade. In Hispania, the Visigoths settle after the defeat of the Kingdom of Toulouse by the Franks of Clovis. Under Alaric II, they consolidate their holdings south of the Garonne, but the Battle of Vouillé in 507 forces them to retreat. They then shift their focal point to Hispania, around Toledo, the political center of the kingdom. The Roman populations, Nicene Catholics, coexist with the ruling Arian elite. Legal discriminations against Catholics persist in some places. However, Roman law inspires the administration, and Latin remains the dominant and administrative language. The Italian peninsula, under Ostrogothic domination, retains the aura of a former central province. Rome still enjoys symbolic prestige, even though Ravenna remains the capital. Eager to display his rank, Theodoric restores various structures and promotes the arts. Byzantine mosaicists introduce new techniques. The Roman Senate, though less influential than before, survives, and some families remain in the nobility. However, the countryside suffers from a decline related to conflicts and lingering divergences with the Eastern Empire. This agricultural fragility reduces production, the fiscal foundation of power. Urban supplies suffer. In this context, the Eastern Roman Empire, governed from Constantinople, exerts significant authority. Justinian Thurfer, who came to power in 527, dreams of restoring imperial integrity. He entrusts his troops to Belisarius, then to Narses for the reconquest. In 533-534, the Byzantine army recaptures Africa from the Vandals, dethroning Gelimer. Carthage, once again an imperial province, sends vital shipments to Constantinople. Then, the Byzantines head towards Italy to confront the Ostrogoths. The initial successes are immediate, but the war drags on. Repeated sieges cause ruin and great suffering to the inhabitants. This Gothic war devastates Italy. As operations unfold, Rome, Milan, and other strongholds switch from one camp to another, causing colossal losses. The Ostrogoths, led by Witigis, maintain a stubborn resistance. Despite their tactical skill, the Byzantine army faces difficulties in stabilizing its conquests. The country turns into a field of ruins, and its agricultural sector collapses. Imperial administrators strive to restore taxation, but the land base diminishes. Meanwhile, Justinian sponsors projects in Constantinople, notably the Hagia Sophia Basilica, which shines as an architectural jewel. Budgets, divided between monumental constructions and military campaigns, increase the fiscal pressure on the eastern provinces of the Byzantine Empire. In 541, an unforeseen scourge further worsens the situation. The first great documented plague pandemic in the Mediterranean world, known as the Justinian Plague. Quickly spreading, it affects Egypt and Syria, then reaches Italy via maritime trade. Hundreds, even thousands, of daily deaths strike Constantinople, where Justinian falls ill but survives. The already scattered imperial armies see their ranks decimated. Logistics collapse, and order in the recently subdued territories is no longer assured. This massacre breaks the demographic balance. Mortality disrupts the equilibrium. Despite the epidemic, Justinian has the Roman law compiled, which began as early as 529. The Corpus Juris Civilis includes the Code, the Digest, the Novels, and the Institutes. Under the direction of the Quaestor Tribonian, the goal is to unify and clarify the inherited laws. This vast project, primarily drafted in Latin, enhances imperial influence over the reconquered West. Meanwhile, Constantinople remains a major intellectual and artistic hub, attracting scholars and artisans. Despite the health alert, the luxury trade in silks and spices continues, symbolizing a certain oriental splendor. The empire attempts to display a resurgent prosperity. Military instability does little to facilitate pacification. In the following decade, the Italian War ends with the final defeat of the Ostrogoths, but the conflict completely exhausts the peninsula. Narses, appointed as exarch, administers a battered Italy, while freight to Ravenna or Rome remains fragile. The local aristocracy, having preserved its rights, defends its interests. In Africa, the Byzantines face some resistance, but granaries and cargoes benefit the imperial army. In Hispania, the Visigoths maintain their independence, and Justinian is content with a few strategic ports,